Poor peasant woman dares to speak to the king, only to be thrown out in front of the entire court. But what if the king just made the biggest mistake of his life? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Great Hall of Thornhaven Castle stood as a monument to power and ancient glory, its stone walls rising high into the vaulted ceiling where wooden beams crossed like the ribs of some massive beast. Torches flickered in their iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across tapestries that depicted the conquests of kings long dead. The floor, composed of gray flagstones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, stretched before the elevated dais where King Aldrich sat upon his throne, a magnificent seat carved from dark oak and adorned with intricate patterns of wolves and ravens. The air hung heavy with the scent of burning wood, roasted meat, and the underlying mustiness of ancient stone that no amount of fresh rushes could entirely dispel. King Aldrich himself was a vision of masculine power and authority. At 32 years of age, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made men straighten their spines and women lower their eyes. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, fell to his broad shoulders in waves that caught the firelight with each movement of his head. His face was striking, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw covered in neatly trimmed beard, and eyes of such piercing gray that they seemed to see through flesh and bone to the very soul beneath. His body, honed by years of training in the arts of war, showed its strength even beneath the heavy layers of his royal garments. He wore a long tunic of deep crimson wool, bordered with intricate gold embroidery that depicted running stags. Over this hung a cloak of thick black fur that draped across his shoulders and down the back of his throne, fastened at his throat with a golden brooch shaped like a crowned wolf. Leather belts crossed his chest and waist, studded with silver and supporting the weight of his ceremonial sword. The king's fingers drummed impatiently against the carved armrest of his throne as he listened to the endless parade of petitioners that had filled his morning. His expression remained stern, almost cruel in its hardness, as he dispensed justice and made decisions that would affect the lives of those who knelt before him. This was the burden of kingship, he reminded himself, though the tedium of it all sometimes felt heavier than his crown. "Your Majesty," announced Sir Godwin, the captain of the guard, his voice echoing through the hall, "the last petitioner of the morning awaits your judgment." Aldrich waved his hand in a gesture of weary permission. "Let them enter and be done with it. I have more pressing matters to attend to than listening to every farmer complain about his neighbor's sheep." The massive wooden doors at the far end of the hall creaked open, and a commotion immediately followed. Two guards entered first, their armor clanking with each step, and between them they half-dragged, half-escorted a figure that caused an immediate stir among the assembled courtiers. Gasps and whispers rippled through the hall like wind through wheat fields. The woman they brought forth was unlike anything the pristine court had seen in many years. Her appearance was that of someone who had traveled far and hard, someone who had known hunger and hardship as intimate companions. Her dress, if it could be called such, was little more than rough-spun cloth the color of mud, torn at the hem and stained with what appeared to be dirt from the roads. Her feet were bare, caked with dried mud that left marks upon the clean floor with each reluctant step. Her hair, though obviously long, was tangled and matted, hanging in disarray around her face and down her back in a mass of dark brown that might have been beautiful if properly cared for. Yet despite her disheveled state, despite the dirt that covered her skin and the exhaustion that seemed to weigh upon her shoulders, there was something about her that caught the eye. Her face, though smudged with grime, showed delicate features beneath the filth. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips that even pressed together in defiance, held a natural fullness. But it was her eyes that truly stood out, even in her degraded state. They were the color of warm honey, large and expressive, framed by dark lashes that no amount of dirt could diminish. Those eyes, bright with intelligence and barely contained emotion, surveyed the grand hall with a mixture of awe and determination that spoke of an inner strength that poverty had not managed to crush. "What is the meaning of this?" King Aldrich's voice cut through the whispers like a blade through silk. His gray eyes narrowed as he regarded the dirty peasant woman standing before his throne, his lip curling with visible distaste. "Who dares bring such filth into my presence?" "Sir Godwin, explain yourself immediately." The captain of the guard stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "Your Majesty, this woman forced her way past the outer gates. She claims to have urgent business with the crown, though she refuses to state her purpose to anyone but yourself. My men attempted to turn her away, but she is remarkably persistent. I thought it best to bring her before you, so that you might pass judgment on her impudence." The woman in question stood straighter despite the guard's grip on her arms. Her honey-colored eyes met the king's gray gaze without flinching, a feat that few nobles managed and no peasant had dared in Aldrich's memory. There was no fear in those eyes, only a fierce determination that seemed entirely out of place in someone of her apparent station. "Speak then," Aldrich commanded, his voice cold and imperious. "You have interrupted the king's business and sullied his hall with your presence. What urgent matter could possibly justify such effrontery? Choose your words carefully, woman, for they may well be your last." The woman took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and surprisingly refined, though roughened by what must have been days of travel and deprivation. "Your Majesty, I am Rosalind of Ashford, daughter of Thomas the Miller. I have traveled 7 days on foot from my village to bring word of grave injustice that threatens your subjects in the Eastern Territories." Ashford? Lord Pemberton, one of the king's senior advisers, spoke up from his position near the throne. He was a portly man, with a gray beard and calculating eyes. "That worthless collection of hovels hardly deserves the name of village. What possible injustice could occur there that would warrant the king's attention?" Rosalind turned her gaze to the adviser, and Aldrich found himself noting the grace of that movement despite her bedraggled state. "Perhaps Lord Pemberton considers the systematic theft of grain and livestock by his appointed tax collectors to be beneath your Majesty's notice? Or maybe the forced conscription of boys as young as 12 into labor gangs is too trivial a matter for royal concern." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. No one, especially not a peasant, spoke to a lord of the realm in such a manner. Lord Pemberton's face turned purple with rage, and he sputtered incoherently for a moment before finding his voice. "These are lies, vicious lies spread by lazy peasants who refuse to pay their lawful dues to the crown. Your Majesty, this woman is clearly deranged. She should be whipped for her insolence and thrown in the dungeons to contemplate the consequences of speaking falsehoods before her betters." Aldrich raised his hand for silence, his mind working quickly. The Eastern Territories had been troublesome of late, with reports of unrest filtering back to the capital. He had assigned Lord Pemberton to oversee the collection of taxes in that region only 6 months prior. Could there be truth to this peasant woman's accusations? Or was she merely a mad woman seeking attention? He studied her more carefully, looking past the dirt and ragged clothing to the woman beneath. She stood tall despite her obvious exhaustion, her shoulders back and her chin raised. Her hands, though rough and work-worn, were clenched at her sides rather than clasped in supplication. Everything about her bearing spoke of education and breeding that seemed impossible for a miller's daughter from a remote village. "You speak well for a peasant," Aldrich observed, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Where did a miller's daughter learn such refined speech and the courage to address nobility without trembling? For the first time, something flickered across Rosalind's face, a shadow of old pain quickly suppressed. "My mother was a lady's maid in a great house before she married my father. She taught me to read and speak properly, believing that education was a gift that could never be taken away, regardless of one's station in life. As for courage, Your Majesty, desperation often accomplishes what bravery cannot." "Desperation?" The king leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued despite himself. "Explain." Rosalind's voice strengthened, passion bleeding into her words. "Your Majesty, Lord Pemberton's men came to Ashford claiming to collect taxes in your name, but the amounts they demanded were 3 times what we had paid in previous years. When my father tried to explain that we had barely enough grain to survive the winter, they beat him senseless and took everything anyway. They took our millstones, our livestock, even the seed we had saved for spring planting, and they did the same to every family in the village. More lies," Lord Pemberton shouted, his jowls quivering with indignation. "Your Majesty, I have the accounting records that show every transaction. These people are simply unwilling to contribute their fair share to the kingdom's coffers." "Then why?" Rosalind shot back, her honey eyes blazing. "Did your men burn those records when the village elder requested copies? Why did they threaten to kill any man who dared to travel to the capital to petition the king? Why did they take young boys from their families, claiming they were needed for work on your estates? But those boys have never been seen again." The hall had gone deathly silent. Every eye was fixed on the dirty peasant woman who dared to accuse one of the king's own appointed lords of such heinous crimes. Aldrich felt a headache beginning to form behind his eyes. This was exactly the kind of complication he did not need, not with the northern lords growing restless and rumors of rebellion stirring in the western provinces. "These are serious accusations," he said slowly, his gaze moving between Rosalind and Lord Pemberton. "Do you have any proof of these claims, woman? Any evidence beyond your words?" Rosalind's shoulders sagged slightly, the first sign of defeat crossing her features. "The only proof was in the records that were burned, Your Majesty. But there are 300 souls in Ashford who can testify to the truth of my words. We are loyal subjects of the crown, and we have always paid our taxes faithfully. We ask only for justice, and for the return of what was unlawfully taken from us." Aldrich sat back in his throne, his fingers resuming their drumming on the armrest. The logical part of his mind urged him to dismiss this woman's claims. Lord Pemberton was a trusted advisor, a man who had served the crown for decades. This peasant was nothing, nobody, a dirty creature who had no business even standing in his presence. And yet something nagged at him, some instinct that had served him well in matters of state. But then his eyes fell again on her filthy state, on the mud caked on her bare feet, and the grime covering her skin. His nose wrinkled at the thought of the smell she must carry, though she stood too far away for him to notice it directly. The courtiers around him were already whispering, already scandalized by her very presence in the hall. How could he, the king, give credence to the words of such a creature? "Enough," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "I have heard quite enough of this absurdity. Lord Pemberton is a respected servant of the crown, and I will not have his reputation tarnished by the ravings of a filthy peasant woman who clearly lacks the sense to know her place." He saw something die in Rosalind's eyes at those words, saw hope extinguish like a candle flame in the wind. But still, she did not look away, did not lower her gaze in submission. "Your Majesty, I beg you," she began, but Aldrich cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You beg nothing. You have wasted enough of this court's time with your accusations and your impudence. Sir Godwin, remove this woman from my sight immediately. Have her thrown out of the castle grounds and see that she is barred from entry henceforth. Should she attempt to return, she is to be arrested for trespassing and dealt with accordingly." "No!" Rosalind's voice rose in desperation as the guards tightened their grip on her arms. "Please, Your Majesty, you must listen. My people are starving. They are suffering. They need your help. Is this the justice of the crown? Is this how you protect your subjects?" Aldrich felt anger flare hot in his chest at her continued defiance. He rose from his throne, his impressive height and powerful build making him seem even more imposing. His gray eyes had gone cold as winter steel. "How dare you question my justice?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I am the king, appointed by divine right to rule these lands. You are nothing but a dirty peasant who has forgotten her place. Be grateful that I do not have you whipped for your insolence before casting you out. Now get this wretched creature out of my sight before I change my mind about showing mercy." The guards began to drag Rosalind toward the doors, but she fought against them with surprising strength, her voice rising above the shocked murmurs of the court. "You are making a terrible mistake. The people suffer while you sit in comfort, blind to the corruption that festers in your own court. What kind of king turns away from justice? What kind of man—" "Silence her!" Aldrich roared, his patience finally exhausted. "I will not be lectured on kingship by a peasant who reeks of pig filth." One of the guards clamped a hand over Rosalind's mouth, muffling her protests as they hauled her bodily toward the exit. But her eyes, those remarkable honey-colored eyes, never left Aldrich's face. Even as she was dragged away, even as the doors closed behind her, cutting off the sound of her muffled struggles, he could still see them in his mind, burning with righteous fury and profound disappointment. The hall remained silent for a long moment after her removal. Then Lord Pemberton cleared his throat delicately. "Your Majesty showed great wisdom and restraint in dealing with that delusional woman. I assure you, the matter in the Eastern Territories is well in hand. The peasants there are simply unaccustomed to paying their proper share, having been allowed to grow lazy under previous administrations." Aldrich nodded absently, but he found his thoughts still lingering on the woman who had been cast out. Something about the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, though he could not quite identify why. She had been impertinent, disrespectful, entirely inappropriate in her behavior. He had done the right thing, the only thing a king could do when faced with such effrontery. So why did he feel as though he had just made a grave error? "Your Majesty," Sir Godwin had returned, bowing low before the throne. "The woman has been removed from the grounds as you commanded. She went reluctantly, but she is gone." "Good," Aldrich said, forcing his attention back to the matters at hand. "Now, Lord Pemberton, let us discuss the preparations for the Northern delegation's arrival next week. I trust everything is proceeding according to plan." As the conversation turned to matters of state and diplomacy, Aldrich tried to push the image of those accusing honey-colored eyes from his mind. He was the king. He had made his decision. That was the end of the matter. Or so he told himself, even as a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he had just turned away the one person who might have told him a truth he desperately needed to hear. The evening air had grown cold by the time Rosalind found herself stumbling through the winding streets of the capital city, her body aching from exhaustion and her heart heavy with defeat. The guards had not been gentle in their expulsion, shoving her through the castle gates with enough force that she had fallen to her knees on the cobblestones. The laughter of the soldiers still echoed in her ears, their cruel jests about dirty peasants knowing their place burning almost as much as the scrapes on her palms. She pulled her torn shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she navigated the unfamiliar streets, trying to ignore the stares of passers-by who gave her wide berth. The capital was unlike anything she had ever seen, even in her current state of misery. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, their walls of stone and timber looming over narrow streets that twisted and turned in a confusing maze. Merchant shops displayed goods behind glass windows, a luxury unheard of in Ashford. Well-dressed men and women moved about their business, their fine cloaks of wool and fur making Rosalind acutely aware of her own wretched appearance. The sky above had begun to darken, threatening rain, and Rosalind realized with growing despair that she had nowhere to go. The few copper coins she had brought with her had been spent days ago on stale bread and water. She had no friends in this city, no connections, no hope. The king had dismissed her without a second thought, had called her filthy and wretched, had refused to even consider that her words might hold truth. Hot tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had not cried when Lord Pemberton's men had beaten her father, had not cried during the 7-day journey on foot to reach the capital, and she would not cry now. Crying was a luxury she could not afford, a weakness that would serve no purpose. Her feet carried her without conscious direction through the city streets, until she found herself in a quieter district, where the buildings were older and more worn. Here the people looked more like her, working folk with calloused hands and tired eyes. A tavern stood on a corner, its wooden sign creaking in the wind, depicting a painted image of a sleeping cat. Warm light spilled from its windows, and the sound of voices and laughter drifted out into the street. Rosalind hesitated at the door, knowing she had no money for food or drink, no right to seek shelter within. But the alternative was spending the night on the streets, and even her pride had its limits. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit her immediately, along with the smell of roasting meat, ale, and unwashed bodies. The tavern was crowded with laborers and craftsmen finishing their day's work, their voices raised in conversation and occasional bursts of song. A large fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across rough wooden tables and benches. "Well now, what have we here?" The voice belonged to a woman who appeared behind the bar, wiping her hands on an apron that might have once been white but was now the color of old parchment. She was perhaps 50 years of age, with gray streaking through her brown hair and laugh lines carved deep around her mouth and eyes. But those eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Rosalind's appearance. "You look like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards, girl. And not a short hedge either." Rosalind straightened her shoulders, trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "I apologize for my appearance, mistress. I am merely seeking directions to the nearest church. I thought perhaps the priests might offer shelter for the night." The woman's expression softened slightly. "The nearest church is St. Benedict's, 3 streets north and 2 east. But Father Thomas locks the doors at sundown, and that was an hour ago. You'll not find shelter there tonight." She studied Rosalind more carefully, her gaze shrewd. "You're not from the city, are you? Let me guess. You came seeking an audience with the king?" Rosalind felt heat rise to her cheeks. "How did you know?" Because you're not the first desperate soul to come to this city hoping for royal justice, and you won't be the last. Did His Majesty grant you a hearing at least? He did, Rosalind said quietly, and then he had me thrown out of the castle for being too dirty to stand in his presence. The woman snorted, a sound of combined amusement and disgust. Sounds about right. The nobility don't like to be reminded that common folk exist, especially when we're not scrubbed and perfumed for their delicate sensibilities. She made a decision, nodding to herself. I'm Margaret, and I own this establishment. You can work for your supper and a place to sleep in the storage room. Nothing fancy, mind you, but it's warm and dry. Rosalind felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly brought those forbidden tears back to her eyes. I would be most grateful, Mistress Margaret. I am Rosalind, and I promise I am a hard worker. I can see that from your hands, Margaret said, noting the calluses and rough skin. Come on then, let's get you fed first. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days. Then you can help me in the kitchen, and we'll see about finding you some clean clothes. Can't have you scaring away the customers looking like something the cat wouldn't even bother dragging in. Over the next hour, Rosalind found herself sitting in the tavern's small kitchen, gratefully consuming a bowl of thick vegetable stew and fresh bread, while Margaret worked nearby, preparing food for the evening crowd. The older woman kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking questions about Rosalind's journey and listening with genuine interest to her tale. Lord Pemberton, you say? Margaret's expression grew dark. I've heard whispers about that one. My nephew works in the castle stables, and he says the other servants talk about how Pemberton's grown rich while the villages in his territory have grown poor. But nobody speaks up because they're afraid of losing their positions, or worse. Then it is true, Rosalind said, feeling vindicated even in her defeat. The king surrounds himself with corruption and refuses to see it. Margaret gave her a sharp look. Be careful how you speak of the king, girl. These walls have ears, and loose talk about His Majesty can land you in serious trouble. But between you and me, she lowered her voice, King Aldrich is not a bad man. Arrogant, yes. Proud and stubborn, certainly. But he's young still, only 32, and he's been on the throne barely 5 years. He inherited a kingdom in turmoil and has spent all his time trying to hold it together through strength and authority. Perhaps he's forgotten that strength must be tempered with wisdom, and authority must be balanced with compassion. Rosalind absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the cold, dismissive man who had ordered her removal from his court. He did not seem young to me. He seemed ancient in his certainty, immovable as a mountain. Mountains can be moved given the right tools and enough determination, Margaret said with a slight smile. Now finish your stew and then we'll get you cleaned up. There's a washroom out back with a barrel of water. It'll be cold, but I imagine you won't mind after 7 days on the road. I'll find you some proper clothes, something that won't fall apart if you sneeze. 2 hours later, Rosalind barely recognized herself. The cold water had been shocking but thoroughly effective, washing away the accumulated grime of her journey. Margaret had provided her with a simple dress of brown wool, worn but clean and whole, along with a linen shift, thick stockings, and a pair of leather shoes that were only slightly too large. The older woman had even helped her wash and comb through her tangled hair, a process that had been painful but necessary. Now, looking at her reflection in a polished copper pan that served as a mirror, Rosalind saw a different person staring back. Her hair, clean and dried by the kitchen fire, fell in thick waves of chestnut brown, shot through with hints of copper that caught the light. Her face, free of dirt, showed the delicate bone structure her mother had always said was her best feature. Her honey-colored eyes seemed brighter, more alive, framed by dark lashes and arched brows. Well, well, Margaret said, standing back to admire her handiwork. You clean up rather nicely, don't you? I dare say if King Aldrich could see you now, he might not be so quick to dismiss you as a filthy peasant. Rosalind touched her clean face wonderingly, hardly able to believe the transformation. For the first time in days, she felt almost human again. Almost like the person she had been before disaster had struck her village. The evening passed in hard but satisfying work. Rosalind helped Margaret in the kitchen, washing dishes and preparing food, serving the tavern's patrons and clearing tables. The work was familiar, not so different from the tasks she had performed in her father's mill, and she fell into the rhythm of it easily. The customers were mostly kind, though some of the men made comments about the pretty new serving girl that made her cheeks burn. It was near midnight when the tavern finally emptied and Margaret locked the doors. Rosalind was exhausted but felt better than she had in weeks, her stomach full and her body clean. Margaret showed her to the storage room, which was small but dry, with sacks of grain and barrels of ale stacked neatly against the walls. A pile of blankets in the corner would serve as a bed. "Thank you," Rosalind said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have been kinder to me than I had any right to expect, Mistress Margaret." The older woman patted her shoulder gently. "We women must look out for each other, especially in a city like this where a young woman alone can face all manner of dangers. Get some sleep, child. Tomorrow we'll talk about what you plan to do next. You're welcome to stay and work here as long as you need, but I suspect you're not the type to give up on your quest for justice quite so easily." After Margaret had gone, Rosalind lay down on the blankets and stared up at the dark ceiling, her mind racing. The older woman was right. She could not simply give up and return to Ashford empty-handed. Her people were depending on her, and her father had nearly died trying to protect what little they had. She had to find a way to make the king listen, to make him see the truth of what was happening in his kingdom. But how? She had been given one chance to plead her case, and she had failed spectacularly. The king had made it clear that he considered her beneath his notice, had barred her from ever returning to the castle. What could a miller's daughter possibly do against such power and indifference? Sleep eventually claimed her, but her dreams were troubled, filled with images of her father's beaten face and the king's cold gray eyes as he ordered her removal from his presence. Meanwhile, in the castle, King Aldrich found himself equally unable to sleep. He stood at the window of his private chambers, looking out over the darkened city below, a goblet of wine untouched in his hand. The room around him was a testament to royal luxury, with its carved furniture, silk hangings, and massive bed piled high with furs and velvet coverlets. A fire burned low in the ornate fireplace, casting a warm glow over everything. But Aldrich felt cold, and the chill had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He could not stop thinking about the peasant woman, could not shake the memory of those accusing eyes and the passion in her voice as she pleaded for justice. He had dealt with petitioners before, hundreds of them, and had learned to distance himself from their problems, to see them as matters of state rather than personal tragedies. It was the only way to rule effectively, to make decisions based on logic and law rather than emotion. So why did this one woman haunt him so? "Perhaps because she was right to call you blind," he muttered to himself, taking a long drink of wine. "Perhaps because you know, deep in your heart, that Lord Pemberton is exactly the kind of man who would exploit his position for personal gain. But admitting that would mean admitting he had made a mistake, that he had allowed corruption to flourish under his very nose. It would mean questioning his own judgment, his own choice of advisors. And a king could not afford to show such weakness, could not afford to second-guess himself in front of his court. He thought of how she had looked, standing there covered in mud and wearing rags, yet speaking with the eloquence of an educated woman. Her mother had been a lady's maid, she had said. What kind of lady's maid could teach her daughter to read and speak so well? And what had driven such a woman to marry a miller and live in a remote village like Ashford? Aldrich found himself wondering what the peasant woman looked like beneath all that grime. He had noticed her eyes, of course. Impossible not to notice eyes like melted honey flecked with gold. And her bone structure had suggested a face that might be quite pleasant to look upon if it were clean. Her figure, though obscured by shapeless rags, had hinted at curves in the right places, a slender waist and womanly hips. He shook his head, annoyed with himself for such thoughts. What did it matter what a peasant woman looked like? She was gone, expelled from the castle grounds with orders never to return. He would likely never see her again, and that was exactly as it should be. Yet even as he told himself this, even as he finished his wine and climbed into his lonely bed, Aldrich could not quite convince himself that he had heard the last of Rosalind of Ashford. Something told him that a woman with that much fire in her eyes and that much determination in her voice would not be so easily discouraged. And despite everything, despite his pride and his position and his certainty that he had made the right decision, a small part of him hoped that he was right about that. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with a steady rain falling from leaden skies. Rosalind woke early, her body still accustomed to the rhythms of village life, where work began at first light. She helped Margaret prepare breakfast for the tavern's residents, a handful of permanent lodgers who rented rooms on the upper floors. and then set about cleaning the common room from the previous night's activities. As she worked, sweeping the floors and wiping down tables, her mind turned over the problem of how to approach the king again. She could not simply march back to the castle. She would be arrested on sight. But there had to be another way, some method of getting her message to someone who would listen. "You're thinking too hard," Margaret observed, bringing in a bucket of fresh water. "I can practically hear the wheels turning in your head from across the room." Rosalind paused in her sweeping, leaning on the broom handle. "I need to find a way to make the king listen, but I do not know how." "Do you have any suggestions, Mistress Margaret? You seem to know a great deal about how things work in this city." Margaret set down the bucket and considered the question. "Well, you can't approach the king directly, that much is certain. But perhaps you don't need to. There are others in the court who might be sympathetic to your cause, people who have the king's ear and might be willing to speak on your behalf." "Who?" Rosalind asked eagerly. "Who among the nobles would care about the suffering of peasants they have never met?" "I did not say nobles," Margaret corrected. "I said people who have the king's ear. There is a difference. For instance, there is Sir Marcus Blackwood, the king's childhood friend and most trusted knight. He is said to be a man of honor and integrity, someone who values justice above political gain. If you could somehow get a message to him, he might be willing to investigate your claims." Rosalind felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "How would I get a message to this Sir Marcus? Surely he does not frequent establishments like this?" Margaret smiled. "No, but his squire does. Young Thomas Blackwood, the knight's nephew, comes here twice a week to play dice with the other young men of the court. He is a good lad, friendly and approachable, without the arrogance that infects so many of his class. He will be here tomorrow evening. Perhaps you could speak with him then." "I will," Rosalind said firmly. "Thank you, Mistress Margaret. You have given me hope when I thought all was lost." The older woman's expression grew serious. "Just be careful, child. The game you are playing is a dangerous one. Powerful men do not like being accused of wrongdoing, and Lord Pemberton will not take kindly to your continued efforts to expose him. Watch your back, and trust no one you do not have to." Rosalind nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. But she had come too far and risked too much to turn back now. One way or another she would see justice done, even if it cost her everything. The following evening arrived with agonizing slowness for Rosalind. She had spent the day helping Margaret with various tasks around the tavern, her mind constantly wandering to the coming meeting with Thomas Blackwood. Everything depended on convincing this young squire to carry her message to his uncle, to make Sir Marcus understand the gravity of the situation in the Eastern Territories. It was a slim hope, perhaps, but it was the only hope she had. As darkness fell and the tavern began to fill with its usual evening crowd, Rosalind found her hands trembling slightly as she served ale and stew to the patrons. She had changed into the cleanest of the dresses Margaret had given her, a deep green wool that brought out the golden flecks in her honey-colored eyes. Her hair was braided and coiled at the nape of her neck in a style her mother had taught her years ago, simple but neat. Margaret noticed her nervousness and pulled her aside during a quiet moment. "Calm yourself, girl. Young Thomas will be here soon enough, and you will do your cause no good if you are so agitated you cannot speak clearly. Remember, you must be persuasive but not desperate, honest but not hysterical. These court folk respond better to reason than to emotion." Rosalind took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "You are right, of course. I just fear that this may be my last chance. If I cannot convince him to help, I do not know what else I can do." "One step at a time," Margaret counseled. "First, speak to the boy. Then we shall see what comes of it." Thomas Blackwood arrived shortly after the 8th bell, accompanied by 3 other young men of similar age and station. Rosalind recognized him immediately from Margaret's description. Tall and lean, perhaps 19 or 20 years of age, with sandy brown hair and an open, friendly face that seemed incapable of deception. He wore a tunic of fine blue wool over leather breeches and tall boots, with a short cloak fastened at his shoulder with a simple bronze clasp. Unlike many of the nobles Rosalind had observed in the castle, there was nothing arrogant or condescending in his manner as he greeted the tavern keeper and settled at his usual table near the fire. Margaret caught Rosalind's eye and gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Taking another deep breath to steady herself, Rosalind picked up a pitcher of ale and approached the table, where Thomas and his companions had begun setting up their dice game. "Good evening, young masters," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "May I bring you some refreshment?" Thomas looked up with a ready smile that seemed to falter slightly as he took in her appearance. His eyes widened just a fraction, and Rosalind saw something shift in his expression, a mixture of surprise and appreciation that he quickly tried to mask with courtesy. "Yes, thank you," he said, his voice warmer than strictly necessary for addressing a serving girl. "Ale for all of us, if you please, and perhaps some of Margaret's excellent meat pies, if there are any left." "I shall see to it at once," Rosalind replied, meeting his eyes directly. "Might I have a word with you in private later this evening, Master Thomas? I have a matter of some importance I wish to discuss with you." The request was bold, perhaps too bold, and she saw Thomas's companions exchange knowing glances and smirks. But Thomas himself simply nodded, his expression curious rather than lascivious. "Of course," he said. "I shall seek you out when we finish our game." Rosalind inclined her head in thanks and retreated to the kitchen, aware of the whispers and chuckles that followed her departure. She knew what the other young men were thinking, what assumptions they were making about a serving girl who requested a private word with a nobleman. Let them think what they would. She had more important concerns than protecting her reputation among strangers. The next 2 hours passed with excruciating slowness. Rosalind went about her duties, serving customers and clearing tables, but her attention kept drifting to Thomas and his companions. She observed the way he laughed easily with his friends, the way he treated the other serving girls with respectful courtesy rather than crude familiarity. Everything she saw confirmed Margaret's assessment. He seemed to be a genuinely decent young man, someone who might be willing to help if properly approached. Finally, as the evening wore on and some of the crowd began to thin, Thomas excused himself from his companions and approached Rosalind where she stood near the bar. "You wish to speak with me?" he asked quietly. "Shall we step outside? It is rather loud in here, and I suspect you prefer privacy for whatever you wish to discuss." Rosalind glanced at Margaret, who nodded her approval. "Yes, thank you. There is a small courtyard behind the tavern where we can talk without being overheard." She led him through the kitchen and out the back door into a small enclosed space where Margaret kept her herb garden and a few chickens. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil and growing things. A single lantern hung by the door, providing enough light to see by. Thomas waited patiently, his expression open and attentive. Up close, Rosalind could see that his eyes were a warm brown, kind and intelligent. There was something trustworthy about his face, something that made her want to believe he would help her. "My name is Rosalind of Ashford," she began, deciding that honesty was her best approach. "I came to the capital seeking justice from the king, but I was turned away and barred from the castle. Mistress Margaret told me that your uncle, Sir Marcus Blackwood, is a man of honor who values justice. I am hoping you might carry a message to him on my behalf." Thomas's expression grew more serious. "Ashford? That is in the Eastern Territories, is it not? Under Lord Pemberton's administration?" "Yes," Rosalind said, encouraged that he knew the geography. "Lord Pemberton's tax collectors have been systematically robbing the villages under his control, taking far more than the lawful tax and keeping the excess for themselves. They have beaten those who resisted, burned records that might prove their crimes, and taken young boys from their families for purposes unknown. My father was nearly killed trying to protect our property. I traveled here to petition the king for help, but he dismissed my claims as lies and had me thrown out." Thomas listened carefully, his brow furrowing with concern. "These are serious accusations, Mistress Rosalind. Do you have any proof?" "Only the testimony of 300 souls who have suffered under these injustices," Rosalind replied. "The written records were destroyed, as I told the king, but surely the word of an entire village should count for something." "One would think so," Thomas said slowly. "But Lord Pemberton is a powerful man with many allies at court. Accusing him without solid evidence is dangerous, both for you and for anyone who supports your claims." He paused, studying her face in the lantern light. "Tell me, why did the king dismiss you so readily? His Majesty can be stern, but he is not typically unjust." Rosalind felt heat rise to her cheeks at the memory. "I arrived at the castle after 7 days of travel on foot. I had no money for proper lodging or the means to make myself presentable. I came before the king covered in mud and wearing rags, and he found my appearance so offensive that he could not see past it to hear the truth in my words. He called me a filthy peasant and ordered me removed from his sight." Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. Yes, I can see how that might have prejudiced him against you. His Majesty places great value on propriety and decorum, perhaps too much value at times. He would have seen your appearance as a sign of disrespect, even if you had no choice in the matter. Is the king so shallow that he cannot look beyond appearances to see justice? Rosalind asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Is he so removed from the reality of his subjects' lives that he cannot imagine someone might arrive in such a state out of desperation rather than disrespect? Thomas held up a hand in a placating gesture. I am not defending his actions, merely explaining them. King Aldrich was raised in the rigid protocols of the court, taught from birth that appearances matter, that how one presents oneself is a reflection of one's character and respect for tradition. It is not right, perhaps, but it is how he was trained to think. He paused, then added more quietly, though I have heard him speak with regret about that encounter. My uncle mentioned that the king seemed troubled after you left, that he questioned Lord Pemberton more closely about conditions in the Eastern Territories. Rosalind's heart leaped with hope. Truly? Then perhaps he is not entirely beyond reach. If he has doubts about Pemberton's honesty, might he not be willing to investigate further? Perhaps, Thomas said cautiously, but he would need compelling reason to act against one of his own appointed lords. The political situation is delicate right now, with tensions in the north and west. He cannot afford to appear weak or indecisive by publicly doubting his own advisors. He fell silent for a moment, clearly thinking. However, my uncle does have the authority to conduct investigations on the king's behalf. If I could convince him that your claims warrant looking into, he might travel to Ashford and see the situation for himself. Would he do that? Rosalind asked eagerly. Would Sir Marcus truly be willing to investigate based solely on my word? Thomas smiled slightly. My uncle is a romantic at heart, though he would deny it if accused. He believes in the old ideals of knighthood, protecting the innocent, defending the weak, seeking truth and justice regardless of personal cost. If I tell him your story, emphasizing the human suffering involved, I believe he will at least consider it. But I must be honest with you, Mistress Rosalind. Even if my uncle investigates and finds evidence of wrongdoing, bringing Lord Pemberton to justice will not be easy. He has powerful friends who will protect him. I understand, Rosalind said firmly, but I must try. My people are depending on me, and I will not abandon them, no matter how difficult the path forward may be. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and Rosalind saw respect growing in his eyes. You are remarkably brave, you know. Most people in your situation would have given up after being rejected by the king. Instead, you are here, still fighting, still seeking another way. That is admirable. Rosalind felt herself blushing under his steady gaze. It is not bravery, Master Thomas. It is simply necessity. What else can I do? My father may die from his injuries if we cannot recover the resources that were stolen from us. My neighbor's children may starve this winter without the grain and seed that was taken. I am not brave. I am simply a daughter who loves her father and a woman who cannot stand idly by while injustice is done. That, Thomas said softly, is precisely what bravery is. They stood in silence for a moment, the cool night air wrapping around them like a cloak. Rosalind found herself acutely aware of Thomas's presence, of the kindness in his eyes and the sincerity in his voice. He was not what she had expected from a member of the nobility, not arrogant or dismissive or cruel. He was simply a good man trying to do the right thing, much like she imagined her own father might have been at that age. I will speak to my uncle tomorrow, Thomas said finally. I make no promises about what he will decide, but I will present your case as compellingly as I can. In the meantime, you should stay here with Margaret. The city can be dangerous for a young woman alone, especially one who has made enemies of powerful men. Thank you, Rosalind said, her voice thick with gratitude. You have given me more help than I had any right to expect, and I am deeply in your debt. Thomas shook his head. You owe me nothing. If your claims are true, and I suspect they are, then helping you is simply the right thing to do. No debt is incurred in the pursuit of justice. He started to turn back toward the tavern, then paused. May I ask you something, Mistress Rosalind? Of course. When you stood before the king, covered in mud and wearing rags, did you truly speak to him as boldly as the rumors suggest? Did you really question his justice and lecture him on his duties as a king? Rosalind could not help but smile slightly at the memory, despite the painful outcome. I did. In retrospect, it was perhaps not the wisest approach, but I was so angry, so frustrated that he would not listen. The words simply poured out before I could stop them. Thomas laughed, a warm sound that seemed to lighten the heavy atmosphere. I wish I could have seen his face. King Aldrich is not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone he considers beneath his station. It must have been quite a shock. He did not seem shocked so much as furious, Rosalind admitted. I thought for a moment he might have me whipped as well as expelled. He would not have done that, Thomas assured her. For all his faults, the king is not cruel. Arrogant and prideful, yes. Blind to his own shortcomings, certainly, but not deliberately cruel. I think perhaps that is why your words affected him so deeply. They struck at truths he has been avoiding, and that made him uncomfortable. They talked for a while longer, with Thomas asking questions about her village and her journey, seeming genuinely interested in her answers. Rosalind found herself relaxing in his company, enjoying the rare pleasure of conversing with someone who treated her as an equal rather than an inferior. When they finally returned to the tavern's common room, she felt lighter than she had in days, buoyed by hope and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had chosen to help her. Thomas's companions had already left, and he quickly took his leave as well, promising again to speak with his uncle at the earliest opportunity. As Rosalind watched him go, Margaret appeared at her elbow. That went well, I take it? The older woman asked with a knowing smile. Better than I dared hope, Rosalind admitted. He is going to speak to Sir Marcus on my behalf. He thinks his uncle may be willing to investigate. And what did you think of young Thomas himself? Margaret asked slyly. I noticed the two of you were out in the courtyard for quite some time. Rosalind felt her cheeks warming again. He is kind and honorable, everything you said he would be. But do not read more into it than is there, Mistress Margaret. He is helping me because he believes in justice, not because of any personal interest. Margaret chuckled. If you say so, dear. But I saw the way he looked at you when he first arrived, and the way he looked at you when he left. Those were not the looks of a man motivated solely by abstract ideals of justice. Rosalind shook her head, refusing to let herself entertain such thoughts. Thomas Blackwood was a nobleman, the nephew of one of the king's most trusted knights. She was a miller's daughter from a remote village. Any connection between them beyond his willingness to help her cause was impossible, and thinking otherwise would only lead to heartache. Yet as she lay in her makeshift bed that night, she could not help but remember the warmth in Thomas's brown eyes, the genuine respect in his voice when he called her brave. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if circumstances were different, if she were a lady and he were simply a kind young man who made her heart beat faster when he smiled. But circumstances were not different, she reminded herself firmly. She was here for one purpose only, to seek justice for her people. Everything else was a distraction she could not afford. Meanwhile, in his chambers at the castle, King Aldrich sat at his writing desk, staring at a letter from the governor of the western provinces. The man was requesting additional troops to deal with what he called minor disturbances among the peasant population. But the carefully worded phrases suggested something more serious than mere grumbling about taxes. Aldrich set the letter aside and rubbed his eyes wearily. Everywhere he looked there seemed to be problems festering beneath the surface of his kingdom, issues he had been too focused on larger matters to notice or address. The peasant woman's words kept echoing in his mind. Is this the justice of the crown? Is this how you protect your subjects? He had been so certain of his righteousness when he expelled her from the court, so convinced that maintaining the dignity and authority of his position was paramount. But now, in the quiet of the night, he found himself questioning that certainty. What if she had been telling the truth? What if Lord Pemberton was indeed exploiting his position for personal gain? The thought made him uneasy, not just because of the injustice it represented, but because it would mean he had failed in one of his most fundamental duties as king, choosing trustworthy advisors and overseeing their actions. It would mean he had been blind, just as she had accused him of being. Aldrich rose from his desk and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened city. Somewhere out there, the peasant woman was probably cursing his name, probably planning her next move. He had thought expelling her would be the end of the matter, but something told him he was wrong about that. Part of him hoped he was wrong. Part of him wanted to see her again, to hear her speak with that passionate conviction, to look into those extraordinary honey-colored eyes and see them burning with something other than contempt and disappointment. He shook his head at his own foolishness. Why should he care what a peasant woman thought of him? Why should her opinion matter in the slightest? But it did matter. he realized with uncomfortable clarity. It mattered because she had seen him not as a king to be feared and obeyed, but as a man to be judged by his actions, and in her judgment, he had been found wanting. 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Rosalind threw herself into her work at the tavern, trying to keep her mind occupied and her hopes from spiraling into despair. Each evening she watched the door, hoping to see Thomas Blackwood return with news, but he did not appear. Margaret tried to reassure her that these things took time, that Sir Marcus was a busy man with many responsibilities, but the waiting gnawed at Rosalind's patience like a hungry rat. On the 4th day, just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, Thomas finally walked through the tavern door. Rosalind's heart leaped at the sight of him, and she had to force herself to finish serving the customer at her current table before hurrying over to greet him. "Master Thomas," she said, trying to keep the desperate hope from her voice, "I had begun to think you would not return." Thomas's expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of something positive in his eyes. "Forgive the delay, Mistress Rosalind. My uncle is a cautious man, and he wanted to make some discreet inquiries before committing to any course of action. But I have news, and I think you will find it encouraging. Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" They retreated once again to the courtyard behind the tavern, where the herb garden was now showing the first hints of new spring growth despite the lingering chill in the air. Thomas waited until they were well away from any potential eavesdroppers before speaking. "My uncle has agreed to investigate your claims," he said, and Rosalind felt relief wash over her like warm water. He made inquiries among some of his contacts in the Eastern Territories, and what he learned troubled him greatly. "It seems there have been whispers about Lord Pemberton's activities for some time, but no one has been willing to speak openly for fear of retaliation. Your willingness to come forward, despite the personal risk, has given him the justification he needs to look into the matter more closely." "When will he go to Ashford?" Rosalind asked eagerly. "What will he do when he gets there?" "He departs tomorrow at dawn," Thomas replied. "He will travel with a small company of trusted men, ostensibly on a routine inspection tour of the Eastern Territories. He will visit Ashford and several other villages, interview the residents, and examine whatever records still exist. If he finds evidence of wrongdoing, he will report directly to the king." Rosalind clasped her hands together, hardly daring to believe that her desperate gamble might actually succeed. "Thank you, Master Thomas. Thank you so much. You have given my people hope when all seemed lost." Thomas smiled, but there was a hint of concern in his expression. "Do not thank me yet, Mistress Rosalind. Even if my uncle confirms your claims, convincing the king to act against Lord Pemberton will be difficult. The political situation is complex, and there are many at court who benefit from the current arrangement. Lord Pemberton has spent years cultivating allies and building his power base. He will not go down without a fight." "I understand," Rosalind said, "but at least now there is a chance. At least someone in authority is willing to listen and investigate. That is more than I had when I first arrived in this city." They stood in silence for a moment, and Rosalind became aware once again of how close they were standing, how the fading light seemed to soften Thomas's features and make his brown eyes appear almost golden. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her breath catch slightly in her throat, something warm and interested that went beyond simple kindness. "Mistress Rosalind," Thomas said quietly, his voice taking on a different quality, "may I speak freely with you? Not about politics or justice, but about a more personal matter." Rosalind felt her pulse quicken. "Of course, Master Thomas." He seemed to search for the right words, his usual easy confidence giving way to something more hesitant. "I have been thinking about you a great deal since our first meeting, about your courage and your determination, yes, but also about you as a person. I find myself wanting to know more about you, about your life before all this happened, about your hopes and dreams beyond seeking justice for your village." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "I realize this is highly irregular, a nobleman expressing interest in a woman of your station, but I have never been very good at following the rules when my heart tells me otherwise." Rosalind's mind raced. She had not imagined Margaret's observations, had not misread the warmth in his eyes. Thomas Blackwood, nephew of the king's most trusted knight, was expressing romantic interest in her, a miller's daughter currently working as a tavern servant. The situation was impossible, absurd, potentially dangerous for both of them, and yet her heart sang at his words. "Master Thomas," she began carefully, "I am honored by your interest. Truly I am. But surely you understand how impossible any connection between us would be. Your family would never accept a woman of my background, and the scandal would damage your position at court. I cannot allow you to risk your future for a fleeting attraction." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his brown eyes, could smell the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to his clothes. "What if it is not fleeting? What if I believe that you are worth any risk, any scandal? I know we have only just met, that circumstances are complicated, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel when I look at you. Tell me you feel nothing, and I will never speak of this again. But if there is even a chance that you might return my regard, I want to pursue it. Propriety be damned." Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. Every practical part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that allowing herself to develop feelings for Thomas would only end in heartbreak. But her heart, that treacherous organ, had already begun to betray her. She liked him, perhaps more than liked him. She enjoyed his company, admired his integrity, and found herself thinking about him far more often than was appropriate. "I would be lying if I said I felt nothing," she admitted quietly. "But Thomas, we must be realistic. Even if your feelings are genuine, even if mine are the same, what future could we possibly have? You are a nobleman with responsibilities and expectations. I am a peasant seeking justice for my village. Once this matter is resolved, I will return to Ashford, and you will remain here. Our worlds do not intersect except in this brief moment of crisis." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His touch was warm and gentle, his fingers calloused from sword practice but careful in their grip. "Then perhaps we should make the most of this brief moment. Perhaps we should allow ourselves to explore what might be between us, even if the future is uncertain. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Rosalind. I am simply asking for the chance to know you better, to spend time with you, to see where this connection might lead." Rosalind looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt, how natural. She thought about her mother's advice given years ago when Rosalind had been just a girl. "Life is short and often hard, my darling. When you find something that brings you joy, hold on to it for as long as you can. Tomorrow is never guaranteed." "Very well," she said, meeting his eyes again. "We can see where this leads, though I still think we are both being very foolish." Thomas's face broke into a brilliant smile that made him look younger and more carefree. "The best things in life usually require a bit of foolishness. May I call on you here at the tavern? Perhaps we could take walks together when you are not working, talk and get to know each other properly." "I would like that," Rosalind admitted, unable to suppress her own smile. "But we should be discreet. If word gets back to the castle that you are courting a tavern servant, it could cause complications for both of us, and especially for your uncle's investigation." "Agreed," Thomas said. "We will be careful. Though I must warn you, Rosalind, I am not very good at hiding my feelings. When I care about someone, it shows." They talked for a while longer, about inconsequential things, now that the weight of politics and justice had been temporarily set aside. Thomas told her about his childhood growing up in his uncle's household, about learning to ride and fight and navigate the complex social dynamics of the court. Rosalind shared stories of her life in Ashford, of working in her father's mill and learning to read from her mother, of the simple pleasures of village life that seemed like distant memories now. When Thomas finally took his leave, promising to return the next evening, Rosalind floated back into the tavern in a daze. Margaret took one look at her face and laughed knowingly. "Well, well," the older woman said. "It seems young Thomas has finally declared himself. I was wondering how long he would dance around the subject." "Is it that obvious?" Rosalind asked, touching her flushed cheeks. "Only to someone with eyes, dear. The two of you look at each other like you have discovered something precious and rare, which I suppose you have. Love does not ask permission or wait for convenient timing. It simply arrives and demands to be acknowledged." "It is not love," Rosalind protested, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Not yet. We barely know each other." Margaret gave her a gentle smile. "Perhaps not yet, but it will be. Mark my words. I have seen enough young couples in my time to recognize the beginning of something real when I see it. The question is not whether you will fall in love, but whether you will have the courage to pursue it when the obstacles seem insurmountable." Rosalind wanted to argue, but she was saved from having to respond by the arrival of new customers requiring attention. As she went about her evening duties, serving food and drink and clearing tables, her mind kept returning to the feel of Thomas's hand in hers, the warmth in his eyes, the promise of something wonderful and terrifying blooming between them. Meanwhile, at the castle, Sir Marcus Blackwood was making final preparations for his journey to the Eastern Territories. He was a man in his late 40s, tall and powerfully built, with gray beginning to streak through his dark hair and a face that bore the scars of many battles. His eyes, the same warm brown as his nephew's, were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He had been troubled by Thomas's account of the young woman from Ashford, and even more troubled by what his discreet inquiries had revealed. There were too many whispers, too many stories that aligned with her accusations. Lord Pemberton had grown wealthy while the territories under his control had grown poor. That in itself was not proof of wrongdoing, but it was certainly suspicious. More concerning were the reports of missing young men, boys taken from their families and never seen again. That smacked of something darker than simple tax fraud, something that made Sir Marcus's blood run cold with anger. As he checked his equipment and prepared his traveling gear, his thoughts turned to his nephew. Thomas had been unusually invested in this case, unusually passionate in his arguments for investigation. Sir Marcus was not blind to the reason why. He had seen the way Thomas's face lit up when he spoke of the young woman, had heard the admiration and growing affection in his voice. Under normal circumstances, Sir Marcus would have discouraged such an attachment. Thomas was heir to the Blackwood estates, destined for a marriage that would strengthen the family's position and forge useful alliances. A miller's daughter, no matter how beautiful or brave, had no place in those plans. But these were not normal circumstances, and Sir Marcus had always believed that honor and integrity were more important than political advantage. If Thomas had found someone who made him happy, someone who shared his values and stirred his heart, then Sir Marcus would support that connection, regardless of the social complications it might create. First, however, he needed to determine the truth of the situation in Ashford. If the woman's claims proved false, then Thomas's infatuation would fade naturally. But if they proved true, if Lord Pemberton was indeed guilty of the crimes attributed to him, then Sir Marcus would move heaven and earth to see justice done. And if that justice also happened to smooth the way for his nephew to pursue the woman he was falling in love with, well, so much the better. At that same moment, in his own chambers, King Aldrich was conducting a private meeting with Lord Pemberton. The older lord stood before the king's desk, his expression carefully neutral, as Aldrich questioned him about conditions in the Eastern Territories. "I have been hearing disturbing reports, Pemberton," Aldrich said, his gray eyes fixed on the lord's face. "Reports of excessive taxation, of violence against those who resist, of young men disappearing without explanation. What do you have to say about these accusations?" Lord Pemberton's face showed just the right amount of concern and confusion. "Your Majesty, I am shocked and dismayed to hear such claims. I can assure you that my tax collectors operate strictly within the bounds of the law. If there have been incidents of violence, they were isolated events involving peasants who resisted lawful authority. As for missing young men, I have no knowledge of any such thing. Perhaps some have left their villages seeking opportunities elsewhere. The young are often restless, eager to escape the drudgery of rural life." Aldrich wanted to believe him. Lord Pemberton had been a trusted advisor for years, had helped Aldrich navigate the treacherous waters of court politics when he first took the throne. But something in the man's tone, some subtle defensiveness, raised Aldrich's suspicions. "Sir Marcus Blackwood is departing tomorrow on an inspection tour of the Eastern Territories," Aldrich said, watching Pemberton's reaction carefully. "He will be visiting several villages, including Ashford, to assess conditions firsthand. I trust you have no objection to this." For just a moment, so brief that Aldrich almost missed it, something flickered in Pemberton's eyes. Fear? Anger? It was gone before it could be identified, replaced by an expression of perfect cooperation. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I welcome Sir Marcus's investigation. It will prove that my administration has been both efficient and just. I am certain he will find the villages prosperous and the people content, despite the lies spread by malcontents and troublemakers." "I hope you are right," Aldrich said neutrally. "For both our sakes." After Lord Pemberton had left, Aldrich sat alone in his chambers, thinking about the peasant woman who had started this entire chain of events. He had ordered inquiries made about her, wanting to know if she had left the city or was still somewhere within its walls. His sources had informed him that she was working at a tavern called the Sleeping Cat, earning her keep while she waited for something, though what that something was remained unclear. He found himself wondering what she looked like now, cleaned and properly dressed. The image haunted him more than it should. The memory of those honey-colored eyes and the passion in her voice. She had called him blind, had accused him of failing in his duty to protect his subjects. The words still stung, but they also forced him to examine his own actions and motivations in ways he had been avoiding. What if she was right? What if he had been so focused on maintaining his authority and dignity that he had lost sight of the very people he was supposed to serve? The thought was uncomfortable, even painful, but Aldrich found he could not dismiss it as easily as he had dismissed the woman herself. Change was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Sir Marcus's investigation would reveal truths that could not be ignored, and then Aldrich would have to decide what kind of king he wanted to be. Would he be the kind of king who valued appearances and political convenience over justice? Or would he be the kind of king who had the courage to admit when he was wrong and the strength to make it right? Only time would tell, but as Aldrich finally extinguished the candles in his chamber and prepared for bed, he found himself hoping that when he next encountered the woman from Ashford, he would be able to look her in the eye without shame. The week that followed was one of the strangest and most wonderful of Rosalind's life. True to his word, Thomas came to visit her every evening, timing his arrivals for when the tavern was busy enough that his presence would not draw undue attention, but quiet enough that they could steal moments together. They would talk in the courtyard, or sometimes take walks through the less fashionable districts of the city where a nobleman and a serving girl would not be so conspicuous. Rosalind found herself drawn to Thomas in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. He was unlike anyone she had ever known, combining the education and refinement of the nobility with a genuine warmth and lack of pretension that seemed almost miraculous. He listened to her opinions with real interest, laughed at her observations about city life, and shared his own thoughts and feelings with an openness that suggested he trusted her completely. "Tell me about your mother," Thomas said one evening as they sat on a bench in a small public garden, watching the last light fade from the sky. "You mentioned she was a lady's maid before she married your father. How did they meet?" Rosalind smiled at the memory, though it was tinged with sadness now that her mother was gone. She worked for a wealthy family in London, caring for the lady of the house and her daughters. "My father delivered grain to the estate from his mill, and he would always find excuses to visit the kitchens where my mother would be collecting items for her mistress. He said he fell in love with her the first time he saw her, though it took him months to work up the courage to speak to her." "And she fell in love with him as well?" Thomas asked. "Eventually, yes. She said he was persistent and kind, that he made her laugh even on difficult days. When he finally asked her to marry him, she said yes without hesitation, even though it meant leaving her position and her life in London to become a miller's wife in a small village. Her former mistress was furious, said she was throwing away a respectable position for a man beneath her station. But my mother did not care about stations or expectations. She only cared that she had found someone who loved her truly." Thomas took her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become familiar and precious over the past week. "She sounds like a remarkable woman. I wish I could have met her. She would have liked you," Rosalind said softly. "She always said that character mattered more than birth, that a good heart was worth more than a noble name. She taught me to judge people by their actions rather than their titles." "Wise words," Thomas said. "I hope I am living up to her standards." "You are," Rosalind assured him. "More than you know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Rosalind felt at peace in a way she had not felt since leaving Ashford, as if Thomas's presence created a small bubble of safety and happiness that the harsh realities of the world could not penetrate. But the harsh realities were never far away, and Rosalind knew that their idyll could not last forever. Sir Marcus had been gone for 5 days now, and word of his investigation was beginning to spread through the city. Thomas had warned her that Lord Pemberton was growing nervous, that there were whispers of him trying to discredit any findings before they could be presented to the king. "My uncle sent a messenger yesterday," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "He has reached Ashford and begun interviewing the villagers. He said the situation is even worse than he feared, that your accusations were, if anything, understated. He has found evidence of systematic theft, extortion, and violence. He has also begun to uncover the truth about the missing boys." Rosalind's heart clenched with dread. What truth? What happened to them? Thomas's expression grew grim. They were sold. Lord Pemberton has been operating a labor trafficking scheme, taking young men from villages that could not afford to complain and selling them to mine owners in the north who need workers and do not ask questions about where they come from. Many of the boys have died from the brutal conditions. Those who survive are worked like slaves until they are no longer useful. Rosalind felt bile rise in her throat. She had suspected something terrible, but this was worse than her darkest imaginings. My God, how could anyone do such a thing? How could he treat human beings like commodities to be bought and sold? Greed is a powerful motivator, Thomas said quietly, and Lord Pemberton has always valued wealth and power above all else. I should have seen it sooner. We all should have. When will your uncle return to the capital? Rosalind asked. When will he present his findings to the king? Within the next few days. He wants to gather as much evidence as possible to make his case so strong that even Lord Pemberton's allies cannot dispute it. But once he returns, things will move quickly. The king will have to act, and Lord Pemberton will face justice for his crimes. Rosalind felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Justice for her village was finally within reach, but she knew that the coming confrontation would be dangerous. Lord Pemberton would not go quietly, and there were many at court who would rather see the matter swept under the rug than face the scandal of one of their own being exposed as a criminal. Thomas, she said hesitantly, what will happen after this is all over? After Lord Pemberton is brought to justice and I return to Ashford? Thomas turned to face her fully, his brown eyes serious and intent. I have been thinking about that a great deal, Rosalind. I know the obstacles we face. I know that my family will object, and that society will condemn any formal connection between us. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. In just 1 week, you have become essential to my happiness. The thought of you leaving, of never seeing you again, is unbearable. Rosalind's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want a future with you, whatever form that future might take. If you will have me, if you return my feelings, then I will find a way to make it work. I do not care about scandal or social conventions. I only care about being with you. Rosalind felt tears prick at her eyes. Part of her wanted to throw caution to the wind, to accept what he was offering without question. But the practical part of her, the part that had been shaped by years of hardship and responsibility, could not ignore the realities of their situation. Thomas, I do return your feelings. I have tried not to, have told myself repeatedly that allowing this attachment to grow is foolish. But my heart will not listen to reason. I care for you deeply, perhaps even love you, though it seems impossible after such a short time. But caring for each other is not enough. You have responsibilities, a future that was planned for you long before we met. I cannot ask you to throw all that away for me. You are not asking, Thomas said firmly. I am choosing. And yes, there will be difficulties. My family will be disappointed, perhaps even angry. Some doors that were open to me may close. But Rosalind, none of that matters if I cannot be with the woman I love. And I do love you. I am certain of it. The words hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying. Rosalind had dreamed of hearing such words, of being loved so completely, but she had never imagined they would come from someone like Thomas, or that accepting them would require such courage. I love you too, she whispered, the admission both liberating and frightening. I do not know how this can possibly work, but I love you. Thomas smiled, an expression of pure joy that transformed his face, and then he leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she did not move, when she instead tilted her face up toward his, he closed the distance between them and kissed her softly. It was Rosalind's first kiss, and it was nothing like she had imagined. It was gentle and sweet, tentative and respectful, yet filled with promise of deeper passion to come. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing slightly faster, Rosalind felt as if the world had shifted on its axis, as if everything that had come before was merely prologue to this moment. We will find a way, Thomas said, resting his forehead against hers. I promise you, Rosalind, we will find a way to be together. Rosalind wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that love could conquer all the obstacles in their path. But even as she sat in the circle of his arms, feeling safer and happier than she had in months, A part of her worried that they were building their dreams on a foundation of sand, and that the coming storm would wash it all away. Unknown to the young couple, their conversation had not gone entirely unobserved. In the shadows at the edge of the garden, a figure watched them with interest. It was one of Lord Pemberton's servants, a man paid to keep watch on anyone who might pose a threat to his master's interests. He had been following Thomas for days, noting his visits to the tavern and his meetings with the young woman. Now, having witnessed their declaration of love, the servant smiled coldly. This information would be valuable to Lord Pemberton, very valuable indeed. The woman had already proven herself to be a thorn in his master's side, and if she also had the affection of Sir Marcus Blackwood's nephew, she represented an even greater threat. Lord Pemberton would want to know about this development immediately, and knowing his master as he did, the servant suspected that Lord Pemberton would move quickly to neutralize the threat before Sir Marcus could return with his damning evidence. The servant slipped away into the darkness, leaving Thomas and Rosalind to their moment of happiness, unaware that danger was already moving against them. Meanwhile, at the castle, King Aldric was struggling with his own turmoil. He had spent the past week questioning everything he thought he knew about his kingdom and his role as its ruler. The more he thought about the woman from Ashford, the more he realized that her accusations had struck at fundamental truths he had been avoiding. He had been a king focused on strength and authority, on maintaining control and projecting power. But in his focus on these things, he had lost sight of the people he was supposed to protect, had allowed corruption to flourish, because addressing it would be politically inconvenient. Sir Marcus's preliminary reports, delivered by messenger, had only confirmed what Aldric was beginning to suspect, that his kingdom was in worse condition than he had known, that his subjects were suffering while he remained insulated in his palace, blind to their pain. The realization was humbling and painful, forcing Aldric to confront aspects of his character he did not like. He had been arrogant, dismissive of anyone he considered beneath his station. He had valued appearance over substance, form over function. He had been, in short, exactly the kind of king his father had warned him not to become. His thoughts kept returning to the woman, to Rosalind of Ashford. She had tried to tell him the truth, had risked everything to seek justice, and he had repaid her courage with contempt and expulsion. The memory of it made him ashamed, made him wish he could go back and make different choices, but he could not change the past. He could only try to do better in the future. Aldric stood at his window, looking out over the city as he had done so many times before, but this time he tried to see it through different eyes, to imagine the lives of the people who lived and worked in those buildings, who struggled to survive and protect their families. For the first time, he tried to see his kingdom not as an abstract concept to be ruled, but as a collection of individual people deserving of justice and protection. It was a profoundly different perspective, and it changed everything. When Sir Marcus returned with his evidence, Aldric would act. He would do what should have been done from the beginning. He would listen, he would investigate, and he would ensure that justice was served, regardless of political cost. And if possible, if fate was kind, he would find a way to apologize to the woman who had opened his eyes, the woman whose honey-colored eyes still haunted his dreams with their accusation and disappointment. He did not yet know that the woman had captured the heart of Sir Marcus's nephew, did not know that she was even now sitting in a garden with Thomas Blackwood, planning a future that seemed impossible. If he had known, it might have complicated his feelings even further, might have introduced an element of jealousy he would not have known how to process. But for now, he knew only that he needed to be a better king, a better man. And that resolution, born from the harsh words of a peasant woman who had dared to speak truth to power, would change the course of the kingdom in ways no one could yet foresee. The pieces were moving on the board, the players taking their positions for the confrontation that was coming. Lord Pemberton, desperate and dangerous, was preparing his defense. Sir Marcus was gathering his evidence, building an unassailable case. Thomas and Rosalind were declaring their love, unaware of the forces moving against them. And King Aldric was finally beginning to wake from the sleep of complacency that had blinded him to the truth. The storm was coming, and when it broke, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with a biting wind that promised winter's final assault before spring could truly take hold. Rosalind woke in her small room at the tavern, feeling both elated and anxious, her dreams having been filled with images of Thomas's face and the memory of their kiss. She touched her lips wonderingly, still hardly able to believe that someone like him could love someone like her. But the warm glow of those memories was tempered by a sense of unease she could not quite shake. Something felt wrong, though she could not identify what. It was like a distant warning bell ringing at the edge of her consciousness, urging caution. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to help Margaret prepare for the day's business. The older woman took one look at her face and smiled knowingly. "You have the look of a woman in love," Margaret observed, kneading dough for the day's bread. Young Thomas finally declared himself, did he? Rosalind felt heat rise to her cheeks. He did. And I told him I loved him as well. I know it is foolish that there is no future for us, but I could not help myself. My heart would not listen to reason. Margaret's expression softened. Love rarely listens to reason, child. That is both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. But I must warn you to be careful. You have made a powerful enemy in Lord Pemberton, and if he discovers that you have won the affection of Sir Marcus's nephew, he may see you as an even greater threat. How would he discover such a thing? Rosalind asked. Thomas and I have been discreet. We meet in quiet places, away from prying eyes. The city has many eyes, and some of them belong to those who would use information for their own gain. Margaret said seriously, "Just promise me you will be cautious. Do not walk alone in unfamiliar areas, and if anything seems amiss, come to me immediately." Rosalind promised, though she privately thought Margaret was being overly concerned. What could Lord Pemberton possibly do to her? She was nobody, a peasant woman of no importance. Surely he had larger concerns than one insignificant girl. The morning passed uneventfully, with the usual flow of customers seeking breakfast and early ale. Rosalind worked efficiently, her mind partly on her tasks, and partly on anticipating Thomas's visit that evening. They had planned to take a walk to the riverside, where they could talk without fear of being overheard. It was just past midday when everything changed. The tavern door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, causing every head to turn toward the entrance. 4 men entered, their bearing and dress marking them as soldiers or guards of some kind. They wore leather armor under heavy cloaks, and their hands rested on the hilts of their swords in a way that suggested they were prepared to use them. The leader of the group was a thick-set man with a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes. He surveyed the tavern's interior with the air of someone looking for prey, and when his gaze fell on Rosalind, his lips curved into an unpleasant smile. "You," he said, pointing directly at her. "Rosalind of Ashford, you are to come with us immediately." Rosalind felt her heart begin to race, but she kept her voice steady. "By whose authority?" "I have committed no crime." "By the authority of Lord Pemberton, acting in the king's name," the man replied. "You are wanted for questioning regarding false accusations made against a lord of the realm. You will come willingly, or we will take you by force. The choice is yours." Margaret stepped forward, placing herself between Rosalind and the men. "This is outrageous. The girl has done nothing wrong. She has every right to petition the king for justice, and Lord Pemberton has no authority to arrest her for speaking the truth." The scarred man's expression hardened. "Stand aside, old woman, unless you wish to be arrested as well for harboring a criminal. This does not concern you." "Everything that happens in my establishment concerns me," Margaret shot back, "and I will not stand by while you kidnap an innocent girl on trumped-up charges." For a moment, tension filled the tavern like a physical presence. The other customers had gone silent, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Rosalind could see fear on their faces, could see that none of them would intervene, no matter how unjust the situation. She could not allow Margaret to be harmed for trying to protect her. Taking a deep breath, she stepped around the older woman and faced the guards directly. "I will come with you," she said quietly. "But I want it known by all present that I go under protest, that these charges are false, and that Lord Pemberton is abusing his authority to silence someone who dared to speak against him." The scarred man shrugged, clearly unconcerned with her protests. "You can say whatever you like. It will not change your situation. Now come along quietly, and there will be no need for unpleasantness." As the guards moved to take her arms, Margaret grabbed Rosalind's hand and squeezed it tightly. "I will send word to Thomas immediately," she whispered urgently. "He will help you. Just hold on and stay strong." Rosalind nodded, drawing strength from the older woman's support. Then the guards were pulling her toward the door, their grip firm, but not yet painful. She caught a last glimpse of Margaret's worried face before she was dragged out into the cold street. The guards had horses waiting outside, and they wasted no time in mounting up and pulling Rosalind up behind one of them. She had never ridden a horse before, and the experience was terrifying as they set off at a brisk pace through the city streets. People scattered out of their way, and Rosalind saw curious and sympathetic faces flash past as they rode. But it was not toward the castle that they headed, as Rosalind had expected. Instead, they took her to a different part of the city, to a large stone building that she recognized from her earlier explorations as Lord Pemberton's private residence. The mansion was impressive, 3 stories of gray stone with narrow windows and a heavy wooden door that looked more suited to a fortress than a nobleman's home. They dragged her inside and down a flight of stone stairs into what could only be described as a private dungeon. The air was damp and cold, smelling of mold and old fear. Rusty iron rings were set into the walls at intervals, and the floor was bare stone stained with substances Rosalind did not want to identify. The guards threw her into a small cell and locked the door with a heavy key. The scarred man leaned against the bars, his expression mocking. "Lord Pemberton will be down to speak with you shortly," he said. "I suggest you think carefully about what you plan to say. His lordship can be quite persuasive when he wishes to be, and it would be unfortunate if you forced him to employ more aggressive methods of extracting the truth." "The truth is what I have already spoken," Rosalind said, forcing strength into her voice despite her fear, "and no amount of threats or violence will change it." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "We shall see about that. Many people have entered this room with such brave words. Most of them changed their tune eventually." He left, his footsteps echoing up the stairs, and Rosalind was alone in the dim cell with only a small, barred window, high up on one wall providing any light. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm and calm despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. This was what she had feared, what Margaret had warned her about. Lord Pemberton had decided she was too dangerous to leave free, and now she was at his mercy, locked in his private prison where no one would hear her screams if he decided to silence her permanently. She thought of Thomas, of the love they had declared just the night before, and wondered if she would ever see him again. She thought of her father back in Ashford, still recovering from his injuries, and of all the people depending on her to bring them justice. She could not give up, could not let fear break her, no matter what Lord Pemberton might do. Time passed slowly in the cell. Rosalind had no way to measure it, but she guessed it was perhaps an hour before she heard footsteps on the stairs again. This time they were lighter, more measured, and when Lord Pemberton appeared at her cell door, he was alone. In the dim light of the dungeon, he looked different than he had in the great hall. His carefully maintained facade of respectability had fallen away, revealing something colder and more dangerous underneath. His eyes, which had seemed merely calculating before, now glittered with malice and barely controlled rage. "So," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "the little peasant girl who thought she could bring down a lord of the realm, did you truly believe you could accuse me publicly and face no consequences? Did you think the king would protect you?" Rosalind stood tall despite her fear. "I thought the king would do his duty and investigate my claims. I thought justice mattered more than protecting the powerful from the consequences of their crimes." Lord Pemberton laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "How naive you are. Justice is what the powerful say it is. The king dismissed your accusations because it was convenient for him to do so, because maintaining the stability of his court was more important than the suffering of a few worthless peasants. You were nothing to him, just an annoying distraction to be swept aside. If that were true, you would not have bothered to arrest me," Rosalind pointed out. "You are afraid of what Sir Marcus will find in Ashford, afraid that the evidence he gathers will prove my accusations true. That is why I am here, not because I am harmless, but because I am a threat you cannot ignore." She saw the flash of anger in Pemberton's eyes and knew her words had struck home. He stepped closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Sir Marcus will find nothing useful, because any evidence that might have existed is being destroyed as we speak. My men are very thorough when it comes to protecting my interests. As for you, you have 2 choices. You can recant your accusations publicly, admit that you lied out of malice or madness, and I will allow you to return to your pathetic village, or you can continue to defy me, in which case you will simply disappear. Another unfortunate soul who came to the city seeking fortune and met with tragedy instead. I will not lie, Rosalind said firmly. No matter what you threaten, no matter what you do to me, I will not help you cover up your crimes. Lord Pemberton's face darkened with fury. Then you are a fool who will die for nothing. Your precious Sir Marcus cannot save you. Young Thomas Blackwood cannot save you. And the king certainly will not save you. You are alone, girl, and no one will even know what happened to you. He turned and strode toward the stairs, then paused and looked back. I will give you until tomorrow to reconsider. Think carefully about whether your pride is worth your life. Many people have discovered too late that stubbornness and courage look very similar to stupidity when you are facing death. Then he was gone, and Rosalind was alone again in the cold darkness of the cell. She sank down onto the stone bench that served as the cell's only furniture, wrapping her arms around herself as the full weight of her situation settled upon her shoulders. She was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of a man who had already proven himself capable of terrible cruelty. No one knew where she was except Lord Pemberton's men, and by the time Margaret could get word to Thomas, it might be too late. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Rosalind felt truly hopeless. She had been so certain that truth and justice would prevail, that speaking out against corruption was the right thing to do. But what good was being right if no one was there to help you, if the powerful could simply eliminate anyone who threatened their position? Tears finally came, hot and bitter, running down her cheeks as she sat alone in the darkness. She cried for herself, for her fear and her hopelessness. She cried for her father and her village, who might never receive the justice they deserved. And she cried for Thomas, for the future they had imagined together that now seemed impossible, a beautiful dream shattered by harsh reality. But even as she cried, even as fear and despair threatened to overwhelm her, a small spark of defiance remained alive in her heart. Lord Pemberton had said she would die for nothing, but that was not true. She would die if it came to that, knowing she had tried to do the right thing, knowing she had refused to compromise her principles, even in the face of death. That would have to be enough. Meanwhile, Margaret had wasted no time in sending word to Thomas about Rosalind's arrest. A young boy who did odd jobs for the tavern was dispatched to the castle with urgent instructions to find Thomas Blackwood and tell him what had happened. Thomas received the news while practicing sword work with several other young knights in the castle's training yard. The moment the boy gasped out his message, Thomas felt his blood run cold. "When did this happen?" he demanded, already moving toward the stables. "Just past midday, sir," the boy replied. "Lord Pemberton's men took her. They said she was wanted for questioning, but Miss Margaret says it is a lie, that they mean to silence her before Sir Marcus can return with his evidence." Thomas did not need to hear more. He knew exactly what Lord Pemberton was capable of, knew that Rosalind was in terrible danger. He had to act quickly, but he also had to be smart about it. Charging into Lord Pemberton's residence without authority would accomplish nothing except getting himself arrested as well. He needed help, needed someone with the authority to challenge Lord Pemberton's actions, and there was only one person who possessed that authority, the king himself. Thomas had never sought a private audience with King Aldrich before, had always kept a respectful distance from the monarch despite his uncle's close relationship with the throne. But this was no time for timidity or proper protocol. Rosalind's life hung in the balance, and he would do whatever was necessary to save her. He strode through the castle corridors with such determination that servants and courtiers alike scrambled out of his way. When he reached the king's private chambers, the guards stationed there moved to block his path. "I must speak with His Majesty immediately," Thomas said, his voice brooking no argument. "It is a matter of life and death." "His Majesty is not receiving visitors," one of the guards replied. "You will have to request an appointment through the proper channels." "There is no time for proper channels," Thomas said, his frustration mounting. "A woman's life is in danger, and only the king has the authority to save her. Now let me pass, or I will force my way through and explain to His Majesty why his guards thought protocol was more important than justice." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure how to handle this breach of etiquette from Sir Marcus's nephew. Their hesitation was resolved when the door to the king's chambers opened, and Aldrich himself appeared, drawn by the commotion. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" the king demanded, his gray eyes taking in the scene before him. Thomas did not waste time with formalities. He dropped to one knee in a perfunctory bow. then rose and met the king's gaze directly. "Your Majesty, I beg your immediate intervention. Lord Pemberton has illegally arrested and imprisoned a woman who accused him of crimes against your subjects. Her name is Rosalind of Ashford, and her life is in grave danger. I request your permission to rescue her from Lord Pemberton's custody before he can silence her permanently." Aldrich's expression changed at the mention of Rosalind's name, surprise and something else, something that might have been concern, flashing across his features. "Rosalind of Ashford," he repeated slowly. "The peasant woman I expelled from the court?" "The same, Your Majesty. And she was right about everything she told you. My uncle has been investigating her claims and has found extensive evidence of Lord Pemberton's corruption and crimes. But Pemberton has acted to eliminate the threat she represents by arresting her on false charges. If we do not act now, she may not survive the night." King Aldrich stood motionless for a long moment, his mind racing as he processed Thomas's urgent plea. The mention of Rosalind's name had struck him like a physical blow, bringing with it a surge of emotions he had been trying to suppress for days. Guilt, regret, and something deeper that he was not yet ready to name. "Come inside," he commanded, gesturing for Thomas to enter his chambers. Once the door was closed and they had privacy, Aldrich turned to face the younger man. "Tell me everything, and leave nothing out." Thomas quickly recounted the events of the past week, how Rosalind had remained in the city, how his uncle had agreed to investigate her claims, and what Sir Marcus had discovered in Ashford. He explained the evidence of systematic theft, extortion, and the horrifying truth about the missing boys who had been sold into brutal labor. As he spoke, Aldrich's expression grew darker, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. "And now Lord Pemberton has taken her?" Aldrich asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "On what charges?" "False accusations against a lord of the realm, according to his men," Thomas replied. "But, Your Majesty, we both know that is merely a pretense. He means to silence her before my uncle can return and present his evidence. If we do not act immediately, she will disappear, just like those boys from the villages." Aldrich moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out over the city. His mind was in turmoil, conflicting emotions and responsibilities warring within him. He had dismissed this woman's claims, had called her filthy and wretched, had ordered her thrown from his presence, and all along she had been telling the truth. She had risked everything to seek justice, and he had repaid her courage with contempt. Now she was in mortal danger because he had been too proud and too blind to listen. "Your Majesty," Thomas said urgently, "I know I am asking much, and I know the political complications this will cause. But Rosalind is innocent. She is brave and honest, and she does not deserve to die because a corrupt lord wants to protect his crimes. Please, I am begging you to help her." Aldrich turned from the window, and Thomas was struck by the transformation in the king's face. The cold arrogance that usually characterized his expression had been replaced by something raw and determined, a fierce resolve that made him look more like a warrior than a monarch. "You are right to come to me," Aldrich said, "and you are right that action must be taken immediately. Lord Pemberton has overstepped his authority, and he will answer for it. But we must be careful in how we proceed. If we simply storm his residence without evidence of wrongdoing, he can claim we are the ones abusing our power. We need to be strategic. With respect, Your Majesty, we do not have time for strategy," Thomas argued. "Every moment we delay is another moment Rosalind is in his power, another moment he could use to hurt her or worse." Aldrich held up a hand. "I understand your urgency, Thomas, and I share it, but rushing in blindly will not save her. It will only give Pemberton ammunition to use against us." He moved to his desk and pulled out a piece of parchment, writing quickly, "I am issuing a royal warrant for Lord Pemberton's immediate arrest on charges of corruption, extortion, human trafficking, and kidnapping. This gives us the legal authority we need to enter his residence and search the premises. He cannot claim persecution when we have the law on our side." As Aldrich wrote, Thomas felt a surge of relief mixed with admiration. He had expected the king to be cautious, to perhaps investigate further before acting. Instead, Aldrich was moving decisively, using his authority to ensure that justice could be served while protecting them from accusations of overreach. "I will lead the arrest party myself," Aldrich continued, sealing the warrant with his royal signet. "Lord Pemberton has abused the trust I placed in him, and he will answer to me directly. You will accompany me, along with a contingent of the royal guard. We leave immediately." Within minutes, the castle was a flurry of activity. 20 of the royal guard were assembled, along with Thomas and 2 other trusted knights. Aldrich himself donned armor for the first time in months, a magnificent suit of plate and mail that gleamed even in the fading afternoon light. Over this, he wore a cloak of royal purple, fastened with a golden clasp bearing the royal crest. He looked every inch the warrior king his father had been, commanding and formidable. As they mounted their horses and prepared to ride, Sir Godwin approached Aldrich with concern written on his weathered face. "Your Majesty, are you certain about this course of action? Arresting a lord of the realm without consulting the council first could cause political complications. The council can voice their objections after Lord Pemberton is in custody and the woman he kidnapped is safe," Aldrich replied coldly. "I have tolerated corruption and abuse for too long because I was more concerned with political stability than with justice. That ends today. Any member of the council who objects can explain to me why they believe a lord should be above the law." Sir Godwin nodded, recognizing the futility of further argument. The king had made his decision, and nothing would sway him from this course. The ride through the city streets was swift and purposeful. Citizens scattered before the mounted column, and word of the king's personal involvement spread quickly through the districts they passed. By the time they reached Lord Pemberton's residence, a crowd had begun to gather, drawn by curiosity and the promise of drama. Aldrich dismounted and strode to the mansion's front door, pounding on it with his mailed fist. When a servant opened it, his eyes widened at the sight of the king in full armor, backed by armed guards. "Inform Lord Pemberton that King Aldrich demands his immediate presence," the king commanded. "He has exactly 2 minutes to present himself before I order my men to search every room in this building." The servant stammered something incoherent and fled into the house. Aldrich waited, his jaw clenched and his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Thomas stood beside him, equally tense, his every instinct screaming at him to rush inside and search for Rosalind. Lord Pemberton appeared within the allotted time, but his usual composure was clearly shaken. He had hastily donned his formal robes, but there were signs of disarray in his appearance that suggested he had been taken by surprise. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, "this is an unexpected honor. If you had sent word of your intention to visit, I would have prepared a proper reception. I am not here for a social call," Aldrich said, his voice cutting. "I am here to execute this warrant for your arrest." He produced the document and thrust it toward Pemberton, who took it with trembling hands. As Pemberton read, the color drained from his face. "Your Majesty, these charges are absurd. I have served the crown faithfully for decades. Surely there has been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was mine, in believing you were an honorable man." Aldrich replied, "You have one opportunity to save yourself from additional charges. Tell me where you are holding Rosalind of Ashford, and tell me now." Pemberton's eyes darted nervously, calculating his options. "I do not know what you are talking about, Your Majesty. I am holding no one. Lying to your king is a treasonous offense," Aldrich said, his patience exhausted. "Sir Godwin, take 10 men and search this house from top to bottom. Find the woman, and bring her to me unharmed. If any harm has befallen her, Lord Pemberton will answer for it with his life." "You cannot do this," Pemberton protested, his composure finally cracking completely. "You have no right to invade my private residence without cause." "I have every right," Aldrich said coldly. "I am your king, and you have committed crimes against my subjects. Now stand aside, or I will add resisting arrest to your list of offenses." The guards moved into the house, and Thomas went with them, his heart pounding with fear and hope. They searched the main floors first, finding nothing. Then one of the guards discovered the stairs leading down to the cellar. Thomas took the steps 2 at a time, emerging into the damp, dark dungeon that Lord Pemberton had constructed beneath his elegant home. The smell hit him first, the stench of fear and suffering that clung to the walls. Then he saw the cells, saw the iron bars and the rusty chains, and fury unlike anything he had ever felt before surged through his veins. "Rosalind!" he called out, his voice echoing off the stone. "Rosalind, where are you?" "Thomas?" Her voice came from the far cell, weak but unmistakably hers. "Thomas, is that really you?" He ran to her cell, and the sight of her nearly broke his heart. She was huddled in the corner, her dress dirty, and her face pale, but alive. Her honey-colored eyes widened in disbelief and relief as she saw him. "I am here," he said, grabbing the bars as if he could tear them apart through sheer will. "You are safe now. The king himself has come to arrest Pemberton. We are getting you out of here." One of the guards produced a heavy ring of keys taken from Pemberton's servant, and within moments, the cell door swung open. Thomas rushed inside and pulled Rosalind into his arms, holding her tightly as she trembled against him. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He said no one would save me, that I would just disappear." "Never," Thomas said fiercely. "I would tear this city apart stone by stone before I let anyone harm you. You are safe now, my love. I promise you are safe." He helped her to her feet, and they made their way back up the stairs into the main house. When they emerged into the entrance hall, Aldrich was still there, and his eyes immediately found Rosalind. For a long moment the king and the peasant woman simply looked at each other, an entire conversation passing between them without words. Aldrich saw the dirt and fear on her face, saw the trembling in her limbs and the tears on her cheeks, but he also saw the unbroken spirit in her eyes, the courage that had not been crushed even by imprisonment and threats of death. And he felt something shift in his chest, something profound and unsettling that he could not quite name. "Mistress Rosalind," he said, his voice gentler than Thomas had ever heard it, "I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. You came to me seeking justice, and I turned you away with contempt. You were right about everything, and I was too blind and too proud to see it. I failed you, and I failed my kingdom. For that, I am profoundly sorry." Rosalind stared at him in shock, clearly not having expected such words from the man who had expelled her from his court. When she finally found her voice, it was steady despite her recent ordeal. "Your Majesty, I accept your apology. But it is not to me that you owe the greatest debt. It is to the people of Ashford and all the other villages that suffered under Lord Pemberton's corruption. They are the ones who need your justice and your protection. And they shall have it," Aldrich promised. "Lord Pemberton will stand trial for his crimes, and every person he has wronged will see justice done. This I swear on my crown and my honor." Pemberton himself had been restrained by the guards, his face a mask of rage and desperation. "This is tyranny," he shouted. "You cannot simply arrest a lord of the realm based on the word of a peasant. The council will never stand for this." Aldrich turned to face him, and the look in the king's gray eyes was colder than winter frost. "The council will stand for whatever I command them to stand for. And if any member objects to seeing a criminal brought to justice, they can join you in the dungeons. You betrayed the trust I placed in you. You exploited and murdered my subjects, and you dared to imprison a woman for having the courage to speak the truth. You will answer for all of it, Pemberton. Every single crime will be laid bare for all to see." He turned back to his guards. "Take him to the castle dungeons. Place him in the deepest, darkest cell you can find, and ensure he is guarded at all times. He is not to speak to anyone except in my presence or at his trial." As Pemberton was dragged away, still protesting his innocence, Aldrich approached Rosalind and Thomas. Up close, he could see the bond between them, could see the way Thomas held her protectively and the way she leaned into his strength. Something twisted in his chest at the sight, but he pushed the feeling aside. "Mistress Rosalind needs medical attention and proper care," he said. "Thomas, take her to the castle. Have the royal physician examine her and ensure she has comfortable chambers to rest in. She has been through an ordeal, and she deserves every comfort the crown can provide." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Thomas said, his gratitude evident in his voice. "Your actions today have saved her life, and I will be forever in your debt." Aldrich nodded, but his eyes remained on Rosalind. "The debt is mine to pay, not yours. I should have listened to her from the beginning. I should have been the king she needed me to be." As Thomas led Rosalind away, supporting her weight as she walked on unsteady legs, Aldrich watched them go with a mixture of emotions churning in his chest. Relief that she was safe, satisfaction that justice would be served, and something else, something more complicated that he was not ready to examine too closely. He had saved her, had used his power and authority to protect her from those who would have silenced her, but in doing so, he had also revealed to himself how much he cared about her fate, how deeply her words and her courage had affected him. It was a realization that would change everything, though Aldrich did not yet know how profoundly or in what ways. For now, it was enough that she was safe, that the right thing had been done, even if it had come almost too late. The crowd that had gathered outside the mansion erupted in cheers as word spread of what had happened. The king himself had arrested Lord Pemberton, had rescued the woman who had dared to speak truth to power. It was the kind of story that would be told and retold, growing in the telling, becoming legend. And at the center of it all was a peasant woman with honey-colored eyes who had refused to be silenced, and a king who had finally learned to listen. The royal physician, a kindly man named Master Edwin with gentle hands and a calming voice, examined Rosalind thoroughly in the chambers that had been prepared for her. Thomas waited outside, pacing the corridor like a caged wolf, until the physician finally emerged with a reassuring expression. "She is physically unharmed, Master Thomas," Edwin reported. Frightened and exhausted, certainly, but Lord Pemberton did not have time to carry out whatever threats he may have made. "She needs rest, warm food, and time to recover from the ordeal. I have given her a mild sedative to help her sleep, and I recommend she remain under observation for at least a day or two." Thomas felt the tension drain from his shoulders. "Thank you, Master Edwin. May I see her?" "Briefly," the physician allowed. "But do not tire her. She needs rest more than anything else right now." Thomas entered the chamber quietly. It was one of the guest rooms in the royal wing, far more luxurious than anything Rosalind had ever experienced. Rich tapestries hung on the walls, depicting scenes of hunts and festivals. A large bed dominated the room, piled high with soft furs and embroidered coverlets. A fire crackled in the ornate fireplace, filling the space with warmth and the scent of burning applewood. Rosalind sat propped up against pillows, wearing a clean nightgown that one of the castle's ladies had provided. Her hair had been washed and brushed, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and the dirt had been cleaned from her face and hands. In the firelight, she looked ethereal, almost otherworldly in her beauty. "Thomas," she said softly, reaching out her hand to him, "I still cannot quite believe this is real, that you came for me, that the king himself arrested Lord Pemberton." Thomas took her hand and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "I told you I would find a way. I told you I would not let anyone harm you. Did you doubt me?" "No," she admitted, though there were moments in that cell when I feared no one would arrive in time. Lord Pemberton was so certain of his power, so convinced that he was untouchable. To see him arrested, to see the fear in his eyes when the king confronted him, it was almost unbelievable. "He was a fool to underestimate you," Thomas said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "You are the bravest person I have ever known, Rosalind. Most people would have given up after being expelled from the court, but you kept fighting. You never stopped believing that justice could be achieved." Rosalind's eyes grew heavy, the sedative beginning to take effect. "What happens now? Will there truly be a trial? Will the people of Ashford receive justice?" "Sir Marcus will return tomorrow with all the evidence he has gathered," Thomas assured her. "The trial will be public, and every crime Lord Pemberton committed will be exposed. The stolen property will be returned to the villages, and compensation will be provided for what cannot be recovered. As for the boys who were sold, the king has already dispatched soldiers to the northern mines to retrieve them and punish those who bought them. Justice will be served, my love. I promise you." "And us?" Rosalind asked quietly, her honey-colored eyes searching his face. "What happens to us, Thomas? I know the king showed me mercy today, but I am still just a peasant girl. Once this is all over, once I return to Ashford, where does that leave us?" Thomas had been thinking about this question ever since he had pulled her from that terrible cell. He knew the obstacles they faced, knew that his family would object strenuously to any formal union between them. But he also knew that he could not imagine his life without her in it, that the thought of letting her go was unbearable. "I have been thinking about that," he said carefully, "and I believe I have a solution, though it will require some courage from both of us. My uncle owns extensive lands in the Eastern Territories, estates that need proper management. He has been looking for someone trustworthy to oversee them, someone who understands the needs of the common people and can ensure fair treatment. I am going to ask him to appoint me as steward of those lands." Rosalind's eyes widened. "You would leave the court? Leave your position here?" "My position here is as my uncle's squire and heir to his estates," Thomas explained. "Managing his eastern properties would be a natural progression of those responsibilities. And the Eastern Territories include Ashford and several surrounding villages. If I were living there, overseeing the recovery from Pemberton's crimes, we could be together without causing scandal. A nobleman managing his family's estates and a miller's daughter from one of the local villages forming an attachment would raise far fewer eyebrows than the same relationship here in the capital." Hope bloomed in Rosalind's expression, but it was tempered with concern. "Thomas, I cannot ask you to give up your life at court for me. You have responsibilities. opportunities here that you would never have in a remote territory. You are not asking, Thomas said firmly, echoing the words he had spoken to her before. I am choosing, and I am choosing a life with you over a life of empty courtly pleasures and political maneuvering. I am choosing love over ambition, happiness over status. If that makes me a fool in the eyes of society, then I am content to be a fool. Tears welled in Rosalind's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I love you, she whispered. I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. And I love you, Thomas replied, leaning forward to kiss her forehead gently. Now sleep, my darling. Rest and recover your strength. We have a future to plan, but it can wait until you are well. As Rosalind's eyes drifted closed, Thomas sat with her until her breathing deepened into sleep. Then he quietly left the chamber, only to find King Aldrich standing in the corridor outside, as if he had been waiting. Your Majesty, Thomas said, bowing quickly. I did not know you were there. I came to check on Mistress Rosalind's condition, Aldrich said, his expression unreadable. Master Edwin informed me that she is well, all things considered. I am relieved to hear it. There was something in the king's tone that made Thomas look at him more closely. Aldrich's gray eyes held an emotion that Thomas could not quite identify, something complex and troubled that seemed at odds with the successful resolution of the day's events. Your Majesty, is something wrong? Thomas asked carefully. Aldrich was silent for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Walk with me, Thomas. There is something I need to discuss with you. They walked through the castle corridors, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors, until they reached a private balcony overlooking the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the city below was beginning to light its evening fires. I owe you my gratitude, Aldrich said finally. If you had not brought Rosalind's situation to my attention, if you had not pushed me to act when I might have hesitated, she would likely be dead by now. You saved her life today, Thomas. We saved her life, Your Majesty, Thomas corrected gently. I could not have done it without your authority and your willingness to act decisively. Aldrich smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it. Always diplomatic, even in private. It is one of your better qualities. He paused, his hands gripping the balcony railing. I could not help but overhear your conversation with Rosalind just now. You plan to request stewardship of your uncle's eastern estate so that you can be near her? Thomas felt heat rise to his cheeks, but met the king's gaze steadily. Yes, Your Majesty. I know it is unconventional, but I love her. I want to build a life with her, and this seems the best way to do that, while still fulfilling my responsibilities to my family. And you believe your uncle will approve this plan? I believe my uncle values happiness and integrity over social convention, Thomas said. He has always encouraged me to follow my conscience and my heart. I think he will support my choice, especially given how instrumental Rosalind has been in exposing corruption in those very territories. Aldrich nodded slowly. Sir Marcus is a wise man, wiser perhaps than I have been. He understands that true nobility comes from character, not birth. He fell silent again, seeming to struggle with something. Thomas, I must confess something to you, and I ask that you hear me out before passing judgment. Thomas felt a flutter of unease. Of course, Your Majesty. When Rosalind first came to my court, when she stood before me covered in mud and speaking with such passion about the injustices being committed against her people, I dismissed her. I was angry at her appearance, offended by her boldness, too proud to consider that she might be telling the truth. But something about her stayed with me, haunted me in the days that followed. Her eyes, her courage, her refusal to be cowed by my authority. I found myself thinking about her far more than was appropriate for a king thinking about a peasant woman. Thomas felt his stomach tighten with growing comprehension and discomfort. When you told me she had been arrested, Aldrich continued, I felt something I had not felt in years. Fear, not fear for my kingdom or my position, but fear for her, for what might happen to her. And when I saw her emerge from that dungeon, when I looked into her eyes and saw that her spirit had not been broken, I realized something that I have been trying to deny. Your Majesty, Thomas said carefully, perhaps this is not something you should tell me. Perhaps not. Aldrich agreed. But I owe you honesty, just as I owed Rosalind justice. I have feelings for her, Thomas. Feelings that a king should not have for a peasant woman. Feelings that are entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. I am not so foolish as to believe I could act on those feelings, or that she would return them even if I could. But I wanted you to know, because you deserve to understand why I acted so decisively today." Thomas stood very still, processing this unexpected confession. The king was in love with Rosalind, the same woman Thomas loved, the woman he planned to build a life with. It should have filled him with jealousy or anger, but instead, he felt only a strange sort of pity for the powerful man standing beside him. "Your Majesty," Thomas said quietly, "I appreciate your honesty, though I confess I do not know how to respond to it. Rosalind and I have declared our love for each other, and I intend to marry her if she will have me." "I hope that does not create difficulty between us." "It does not," Aldrich assured him quickly. "I would never interfere with your happiness or hers. What I feel for her is my burden to bear, not yours or hers. I am telling you this not to claim any rights or create complications, but simply because I believe honesty is the foundation of trust, and I need you to trust me, Thomas. I need you to believe that when I make decisions regarding Rosalind or the Eastern Territories, I am acting out of genuine desire for justice, not out of some misguided hope of winning her affection." Thomas studied the king's face and saw genuine sincerity there, along with a loneliness that he had never noticed before. Aldrich was a young man, barely older than Thomas himself, who had been thrust into a position of immense power and responsibility. He was surrounded by advisors and courtiers, but how many true friends did he have? How many people saw him as a man rather than as a crown? "I believe you, Your Majesty," Thomas said, "and I thank you for your honesty. It takes courage to admit such feelings, especially when you know they cannot be acted upon." Aldrich gave him a genuine smile, the first Thomas had ever seen from him. "Perhaps Rosalind is teaching all of us something about courage." "She certainly taught me about humility and justice. Those are lessons I desperately needed to learn." They stood together on the balcony for a while longer, watching the sun complete its descent and the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. An unlikely friendship was forming between them, built on shared respect and honest conversation. It was the kind of friendship that might not have been possible before, when Aldrich had been too proud and too certain of his own superiority. But Rosalind had changed him, had forced him to see the world through different eyes. And in doing so, she had made him a better king and a better man. The next day brought Sir Marcus's return to the capital. He arrived with a wagon full of documents and testimony, evidence so comprehensive and damning that even Lord Pemberton's staunchest allies could not dispute it. The trial was scheduled for 3 days hence, to be held in the Great Hall before the assembled court and representatives from the affected villages. Rosalind spent those 3 days recovering her strength in the castle chambers. Thomas visited her daily, bringing news of the trial preparations and sitting with her for hours, talking about their future plans. She met Sir Marcus, who proved to be as honorable and kind as Thomas had described, and who gave his wholehearted blessing to their relationship. "My nephew has excellent taste," Sir Marcus told Rosalind with a warm smile, "and more importantly, excellent judgment of character. Any woman who has the courage to stand up to both Lord Pemberton and the king himself is exactly the kind of strong partner Thomas needs." King Aldrich also visited Rosalind once during those 3 days, accompanied by proper chaperones to ensure propriety. Their conversation was formal but cordial, with Aldrich asking detailed questions about conditions in Ashford and the other villages, taking careful notes of everything she told him. "I am learning," he told her at one point, "that being a good king requires more than strength and authority. It requires listening, truly listening, to the people one serves. You taught me that lesson, Mistress Rosalind, and I am grateful for it, even if the manner of teaching was painful for both of us." Rosalind found herself warming to this version of the king, so different from the cold, arrogant man who had expelled her from his court. She could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, the sincere desire to be better, to do better. And she found she could forgive him for his initial rejection, understanding now that he had been as much a victim of his upbringing and position as she had been of Lord Pemberton's corruption. On the day of the trial, the Great Hall was packed to capacity. Representatives from Ashford and the other affected villages had been brought to the capital at the Crown's expense, given the opportunity to see justice done with their own eyes. The common people of the city crowded into the back of the hall and spilled out into the courtyards, eager to witness this unprecedented event. Rosalind sat in a place of honor near the front, with Thomas beside her and Sir Marcus on her other side. She wore a dress provided by the castle, a beautiful gown of deep blue wool with silver embroidery, far finer than anything she had ever owned. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style, and she looked every inch a lady, though her humble origins were well known to all present. King Aldrich presided over the trial from his throne, his expression stern and impartial. Lord Pemberton stood in chains before him, his formerly proud bearing reduced to sullen defiance. The evidence was presented methodically and thoroughly. Sir Marcus testified about what he had found in the villages, presenting documents that proved systematic overtaxation and theft. Witnesses from Ashford and other villages told their stories, describing beatings and intimidation, stolen property and missing children. The mine owners from the north were brought in chains to testify about purchasing young workers from Pemberton's agents, workers who had been taken from their families against their will. The trial continued for hours, each piece of evidence adding another stone to the overwhelming weight of Lord Pemberton's guilt. The accused lord attempted to defend himself, claiming that he had been acting within his rights as administrator of the Eastern Territories, that any abuses had been committed by subordinates without his knowledge. But his arguments rang hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence arrayed against him. When Rosalind was called to give her testimony, the hall fell silent. She rose from her seat with quiet dignity, aware that every eye in the room was upon her. Thomas squeezed her hand encouragingly before releasing it, and she walked to the center of the hall where witnesses were required to stand. King Aldrich looked down at her from his throne, his gray eyes meeting her honey-colored ones. "Mistress Rosalind of Ashford," he said formally, "you stand before this court as the woman who first brought these crimes to our attention. Tell us in your own words, what led you to make the journey to this city and seek royal justice?" Rosalind took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the packed hall. "Your Majesty, honored members of the court, I came to this city because my people were suffering and had no one else to turn to. Lord Pemberton's tax collectors came to Ashford claiming to act in the king's name, but they took far more than the lawful tax. When my father, Thomas the miller, tried to explain that we could not pay what they demanded and still survive the winter, they beat him nearly to death. They destroyed our millstones, took our livestock, and burned the records that would have proven their theft. They did the same to every family in our village." She paused, her voice thickening with emotion as she continued. "But the taxation was not the worst of it. They also took young boys from their families, boys as young as 12, telling us they were needed for work on Lord Pemberton's estates. Those boys never returned, and when families asked about them, they were threatened with violence if they persisted. We later learned that those boys had been sold to mine owners in the north, sold like cattle to work in conditions so brutal that many died within months." A ripple of horror and anger moved through the assembled crowd. Rosalind saw tears on the faces of some of the village representatives, saw rage on the faces of others. "I came to the capital because I believed that the king, if he knew what was happening, would put a stop to it." Rosalind continued, looking directly at Aldrich. "I believed in the justice of the crown, in the idea that even a humble miller's daughter could petition for help when all other avenues had failed. When I was first turned away, when His Majesty dismissed my claims, I will not lie and say I did not feel despair. But I could not give up, because too many people were depending on me. So I stayed, and I found others willing to listen, others willing to investigate, and eventually the truth was revealed." She turned to face Lord Pemberton, who glared at her with undisguised hatred. "Lord Pemberton, you called me a liar and a troublemaker. You said peasants like me were too lazy to pay their fair share of taxes. You imprisoned me and threatened my life to try to silence me. But here we stand, and the truth has been proven. You are the liar, you are the criminal, and no amount of noble birth or political connections can save you from the consequences of your actions." The hall erupted in applause and cheers, the common people especially vocal in their approval. Aldrich had to call for order several times before the noise subsided enough for the trial to continue. Lord Pemberton was given one final opportunity to speak in his own defense, but his words were those of a desperate man grasping at straws. He blamed his subordinates, claimed he had been unaware of the extent of the abuses, suggested that the witnesses had been coached or bribed, but no one believed him. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too consistent. Finally, King Aldrich rose from his throne, and the hall fell silent once more. His voice, when he spoke, was grave and filled with the weight of royal authority. "Lord Pemberton, You have been charged with corruption, extortion, theft, human trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence against you is overwhelming and irrefutable. You have betrayed the trust placed in you, abused your position for personal gain, and caused immeasurable suffering to the people you were sworn to protect. You have brought shame upon your family name and disgrace upon the nobility. He paused, letting the words sink in, then continued. This court finds you guilty of all charges. You are hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and privileges. Your estates are forfeit to the crown, to be used as compensation for your victims. As for your punishment, you will spend the remainder of your life in the royal dungeons, performing hard labor alongside common criminals. You will know what it is to suffer as those boys you sold into slavery suffered, and you will have ample time to contemplate the consequences of your greed and cruelty. The crowd erupted again, this time in triumphant celebration. Rosalind felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief and vindication. Justice had been done. Her people would be compensated. The boys who had survived the mines would be returned to their families. Lord Pemberton would never hurt anyone again. As the former lord was led away in chains, still protesting and cursing, Aldrich gestured for Rosalind to approach the throne. She did so, her heart pounding, unsure what the king intended. "Mistress Rosalind," Aldrich said, his voice now gentle rather than stern, "you have rendered this kingdom a service that can never be fully repaid. You exposed corruption that I, in my blindness and pride, had failed to see. You persevered in the face of rejection, imprisonment, and mortal danger. You are a credit to your village and to all my subjects who struggle daily with hardship and injustice." He descended from the throne and stood before her, looking into her eyes with an expression of profound respect and something deeper that made her breath catch slightly. "I hereby grant you and your family full restitution for all that was stolen from you," he continued. "Your father's mill will be rebuilt and improved at crown expense. The village of Ashford will receive compensation sufficient to see it through the next 3 years, ensuring that no one will go hungry or suffer want. And I am establishing a new position, Royal Advocate for the Common People. This person will have the authority to investigate complaints from any subject, regardless of station, and bring them directly to my attention. I can think of no one better suited to this position than you, Mistress Rosalind." Rosalind stared at him in shock. "Your Majesty, I am honored beyond words, but I am not educated in law or governance. I am simply a miller's daughter." "You are a woman of courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice," Aldrich corrected. "Those qualities are far more valuable than any formal education, and you will have advisors to help you with the legal complexities. What matters is that you understand the struggles of common people in a way that no noble ever could. You will be their voice at court, ensuring that what happened to Ashford never happens to any village again." Before Rosalind could respond, Thomas stepped forward and bowed to the king. "Your Majesty, if I may speak?" Aldrich nodded. "Of course, Thomas. I am deeply grateful for the honor you bestow upon Mistress Rosalind," Thomas said carefully. "However, I must inform you that I have asked her to marry me, and she has accepted. I have already received my uncle's blessing to assume stewardship of his eastern estates, where I will oversee the recovery from Lord Pemberton's crimes. While I am certain Rosalind could fulfill the role of royal advocate admirably, I wonder if her place might be better suited at my side, helping to rebuild the territories that have suffered so greatly." The hall had gone silent again, everyone waiting to see how the king would respond to this unexpected development. Aldrich's expression was unreadable as he looked between Thomas and Rosalind, but those who knew him well could see the subtle tightening around his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Aldrich's face relaxed into a smile, genuine and warm, though perhaps tinged with a hint of sadness that only the most observant might notice. "Then I must offer my congratulations to you both," he said, his voice steady. "Thomas, you are a fortunate man to have won the heart of such a remarkable woman, and Mistress Rosalind, you could not ask for a better partner than Thomas Blackwood. He is honorable, brave, and devoted. I have no doubt you will be very happy together." He paused, then addressed the assembled court. "Let it be known that Thomas Blackwood, nephew of Sir Marcus Blackwood, is appointed royal steward of the Eastern Territories. He will oversee the rebuilding and recovery of all villages affected by Lord Pemberton's crimes, with full authority to implement whatever measures he deems necessary to to restore prosperity and justice to the region, and Mistress Rosalind of Ashford will serve as his partner in this endeavor. Her insights and understanding of the common people's needs invaluable in ensuring that the reforms we implement truly serve those they are meant to help. He turned back to Rosalind and Thomas, lowering his voice so that only they could hear. I want you both to be happy. You deserve happiness. After everything you have been through, build a good life together in the Eastern Territories. Make those lands a model of what this kingdom should be, just, prosperous, and compassionate, and know that you will always have the full support of the crown in your endeavors. Rosalind saw something in the king's eyes that made her heart ache with unexpected sympathy. She understood, in that moment, what he was not saying, what he could never say publicly. He cared for her, perhaps even loved her in his own way. But he was king, bound by duty and responsibility, and he would never allow his personal feelings to interfere with what was right and just. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said softly, for everything, for listening, for acting, for giving us this opportunity to serve. We will not disappoint you. I know you will not, Aldrich replied. Then, more loudly for the court to hear, this trial is concluded. Justice has been served, and a new chapter begins for the Eastern Territories and for this kingdom. Let us all take the lessons learned here to heart and work together to ensure that such abuses never occur again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Rosalind and Thomas were married in a simple but beautiful ceremony in the castle chapel, with Sir Marcus giving her away and King Aldrich himself in attendance. Margaret from the tavern was there too, weeping happy tears and declaring that she had known from the first moment that these two were meant for each other. The wedding was not the grand affair that might have been expected for a nobleman's nephew, but it was perfect in its intimacy and sincerity. Rosalind wore a gown of cream-colored silk, simple in design but exquisitely made, with flowers woven into her chestnut hair. Thomas had never looked more handsome than he did in his formal attire, his brown eyes shining with love and joy as he spoke his vows. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and Thomas kissed her for the first time as her husband, Rosalind felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. All the suffering and fear of the past weeks seemed to fade away, replaced by the certainty that she had found her partner, her love, her home. King Aldrich watched the ceremony from his place among the guests, his expression carefully neutral, but those who knew to look for it could see the way his hands clenched briefly when the couple kissed, the way his eyes closed for just a moment as if in pain. Then the moment passed, and he was smiling and applauding along with everyone else, the perfect image of a gracious sovereign celebrating his subjects' happiness. After the ceremony, there was a feast in the great hall, more modest than a typical noble wedding, but still generous and joyful. Toasts were made, songs were sung, and the atmosphere was one of genuine celebration. Representatives from Ashford and the other eastern villages had been invited, and they raised their cups to the couple who would be overseeing their recovery and renewal. Rosalind's father had been brought to the capital for the wedding, still recovering from his injuries but strong enough to travel. When he saw his daughter in her wedding dress, tears streamed down his weathered face. Your mother would have been so proud of you, he whispered as he embraced her. Not just for the marriage, though Thomas is a fine young man, but for everything you have done. You brought justice to our village, you stood up to the powerful, and you never gave up even when it seemed hopeless. You are the bravest person I have ever known, my darling girl. I learned it from you, Father, Rosalind replied, holding him tightly. You taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. You taught me that integrity matters more than safety. As the celebration continued into the evening, King Aldrich found a quiet moment to speak with the newlyweds privately. He drew them aside to a small antechamber off the main hall, where they could talk without being overheard. I wanted to give you both my personal congratulations, he said, and to thank you again for everything you have done for this kingdom. Thomas, your uncle tells me that you have already begun planning the reconstruction of the Eastern Territories. I want you to know that you have unlimited access to the royal treasury for this purpose. Spare no expense in making those villages prosperous again. Thank you, Your Majesty, Thomas said. We will use those resources wisely, I promise you. Aldrich nodded, then turned to Rosalind. And you, Mistress Rosalind, or should I say Lady Rosalind, now that you are married to a nobleman. Rosalind smiled slightly. I think I will always be just Rosalind, Your Majesty. Titles have never suited me. Perhaps not, Aldrich agreed. But you wear dignity and grace as naturally as others wear silk and jewels. I hope you will write to me regularly, informing me of conditions in the Eastern Territories and advising me on matters affecting the common people. Your perspective is invaluable, and I need voices like yours to help me govern justly. I will, Rosalind promised. And Your Majesty, I want you to know that I have forgiven you for turning me away that first day. I understand now that you were trapped by your own upbringing and expectations. What matters is that you learned and changed. You became the king I believed you could be. Aldrich's composure cracked slightly, and for a moment, Rosalind saw the lonely young man beneath the crown, the man who had feelings he could never act upon, who had to put duty before desire every day of his life. Thank you, he said quietly. That means more to me than you know. I wish you both every happiness. You deserve it, more than anyone I have ever known. After he left, Thomas put his arm around Rosalind's waist and pulled her close. He loves you, you know, he said gently. I can see it in the way he looks at you, hear it in his voice when he speaks to you. I know, Rosalind admitted, and part of me feels sorry for him. He is so powerful in so many ways, yet powerless in the one way that might bring him true happiness. He can never act on his feelings, can never pursue what he really wants. Do you have feelings for him? Thomas asked, and there was no jealousy in the question, only genuine curiosity. Rosalind considered the question carefully. I respect him, and I am grateful for what he did to save me and bring justice to my people. I even care about him in a way, want him to be happy and to be a good king. But I do not love him, Thomas. Not the way I love you. What I feel for you is so much deeper, so much more real. You are my partner, my equal, my best friend. The king could never be those things to me, even if circumstances were different. Thomas kissed her softly. I am the luckiest man alive. We are both lucky, Rosalind corrected. We found each other against all odds, and we have the chance to build something meaningful together. Not just a marriage, but a better future for the people of the Eastern Territories. 3 days later, Rosalind and Thomas departed for the Eastern Territories, accompanied by Sir Marcus and a company of royal engineers, builders, and supplies. The journey took a week, but it was nothing like Rosalind's desperate trek to the capital. This time she rode in a comfortable carriage, well-fed and protected, with her husband beside her and hope in her heart. When they arrived in Ashford, the entire village turned out to greet them. People lined the streets, cheering and throwing flowers, celebrating not just the return of their champion, but the promise of a new beginning. Rosalind's father stood at the front of the crowd, his arm in a sling but his smile wide and proud. The mill had already been partially rebuilt with the initial funds from the crown, and plans were underway for improvements that would make it more efficient and productive. Similar projects were planned for all the villages in the territory, along with a new system of fair taxation and oversight to prevent future abuses. Thomas and Rosalind took up residence in the manor house that had once belonged to Lord Pemberton's local administrator, transforming it from a symbol of oppression into a center of justice and community support. They worked tirelessly over the months that followed, meeting with village leaders, implementing reforms, and ensuring that every family received the compensation and support they had been promised. It was not easy work. There were setbacks and challenges, moments of frustration and exhaustion. But through it all, Thomas and Rosalind had each other, their love providing strength and comfort when the burdens seemed too heavy to bear. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the Eastern Territories began to flourish. Villages that had been struggling to survive became prosperous once more. Children who had gone hungry now had full bellies. Families torn apart by Lord Pemberton's crimes were reunited as the surviving boys from the mines were returned home. And in the capital, King Aldrich governed with new wisdom and compassion, guided by the lessons a brave peasant woman had taught him about justice, humility, and the true meaning of leadership. He never married, despite pressure from his advisors to secure the succession. Some said he was too devoted to his kingdom to share his heart. Others whispered that he had given his heart to someone he could never have, and remained faithful to that impossible love. Rosalind wrote to him regularly as promised, long letters filled with observations about life in the territories and suggestions for reforms that might benefit the common people throughout the kingdom. Aldrich treasured these letters, reading them multiple times and implementing many of her suggestions. Through their correspondence, an unlikely friendship deepened. built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Years passed, and the story of Rosalind of Ashford became legend. Songs were written about the peasant woman who had dared to challenge a king and exposed corruption in the realm. Children grew up hearing tales of her courage, and "what would Rosalind do?" became a common refrain when people faced difficult moral choices. Thomas and Rosalind built a family of their own, raising children who grew up understanding that nobility came from character, not birth, and that every person deserved dignity and justice regardless of their station. Their home was always open to those in need, and they never forgot what it was like to struggle and suffer. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Rosalind would stand at the window of their manor house and look toward the distant capital. She would think of the king in his lonely castle, surrounded by power and privilege, but denied the simple comfort of loving freely. And she would say a silent prayer for him, hoping that someday, somehow, he would find his own happiness. For she had learned, through all her trials and triumphs, that true justice meant more than punishing the guilty and rewarding the innocent. It meant creating a world where everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the mightiest king, had the chance to live with dignity, love freely, and find their own path to happiness. That was the legacy she and Thomas were building in the Eastern Territories, and it was a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the power of courage, love, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The dirty peasant woman who had been thrown out of the king's court had indeed been the woman of his dreams, though not in the way the story might have ended in a fairy tale. She had not become his queen, but she had become something perhaps more important: the voice of his conscience, the reminder of his duty, the inspiration for his transformation from an arrogant young king into a just and compassionate ruler. And in the end, was that not a kind of love story too? The love of a king for his kingdom, inspired by the courage of one extraordinary woman. The love of two people who found each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and purpose. The love of justice, of truth, of the belief that the world could be better if people were brave enough to fight for it. As the sun set over the Eastern Territories, casting golden light across the rebuilt villages and thriving fields, Rosalind smiled. She had everything she had ever dreamed of and more: a husband she adored, work that mattered, a community that valued her, and the knowledge that she had made a real difference in the world. It had all begun with a desperate journey to seek justice from an arrogant king. It had ended with a love that transformed not just two lives, but an entire kingdom. And that, Rosalind thought as Thomas came to stand beside her at the window, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder, was the best kind of happy ending anyone could ask for.